Shall we begin? It's a great honor to be here with you today to discuss a really grave international crisis and to have such distinguished guests to help us think this through. I'm Greg Stanton. I'm the president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars and also the president of Genocide Watch. And we are among the first organizations to have called attention to this really serious danger to international peace and the very serious danger of genocide that it entails. I won't say anything more because I think it's time for us to hear the people you really came to hear. And so I want, without any further ado, to introduce to you a real hero in the anti-genocide struggle. She's someone who I have met at many of these sorts of occasions in the past, most recently at the commemoration of the Armenian Genocide. She is the ranking member of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, and that is Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm embarrassed to be the first speaker when you have so many incredible panelists who will be presenting, but unfortunately the House calendar and the schedule being what it is, I'm going to have to speak and leave. So pardon me, my fellow panelists, for not being able to be here with you for the duration. And some of you have faced firsthand the unimaginable, and some continue to risk their safety even to this day by participating in this conference. For your commitment and for your bravery in pursuing what is right and just, I am eternally grateful. It is wonderful to see you all here. Before there were bricks to build a crematoria during the Holocaust, and before there were armies to carry out Hitler's nefarious plans, words were the first weapon in Hitler's arsenal against the Jewish people. It was in the wake of the Holocaust that the United Nations was founded to save succeeding generations, and this is in their mission, from the scourge of war and uphold and protect the dignity and worth of every person. The definition of genocide under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide includes a prohibition on conspiracy to commit genocide, as well as direct and public incitement to commit genocide. Article 4 of the Convention provides that individuals committing any of the listed crimes of genocide shall be punished, quote, whether they are constitutional responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals, end quote. Yet, we have a leader, so-called leader like Ahmadinejad, who has consistently called for the destruction of the Jewish state of Israel with virtual impunity. On October 26, 2005, at the World Without Zionism conference in Tehran, Ahmadinejad called for Israel, as we all know, to be wiped off the map, described Israel as a disgraceful blot on the face of the Islamic world, and declared that anyone who recognizes Israel will burn in the fire of the Islamic nation's fury. On December 12, 2006, Ahmadinejad addressed a conference in Tehran questioning the historical veracity of the Holocaust and said that Israel would soon be wiped out. On Israel's 60th birthday, Ahmadinejad gave a speech in which, according to the official Iranian news agency, he stated that Israel was on its way to destruction. In a public address which aired on the Iranian news channel on June 2, 2008, Ahmadinejad stated again, called for this worm of corruption in reference to Israel to be wiped out. Not only has he made clear his intent, stating that while some may say that the idea of a greater Israel has expired, I say the idea of a lesser Israel has expired too. He also called the Holocaust a fake and accused Israel of perpetuating a Holocaust on Palestinians. Yet Ahmadinejad is hardly alone in this incendiary rhetoric. On December 15, 2000, the Iranian Supreme Leader, Khamenei, stated to thousands of Muslim worshippers in Tehran that Iran's stance has always been clear on this ugly phenomenon, which is Israel. We have repeatedly said that this cancerous tumor of a state should be removed and must be removed from the region. The Congress has repeatedly adopted resolutions denouncing the Iranian regime, its belligerent rhetoric, its behavior, and urging responsible nations to hold Tehran accountable and prevent it from achieving its horrific goals. It is against this backdrop that I would like to briefly discuss with you Congress's wider role, not only in actively confronting the Iranian regime, but also addressing the totality of the Iranian threat and the corrupt organizations that the United Nations, the very body created out of the ashes of the Second World War, has become. The threat of the Iranian regime and the threat that it poses to the United States, to Israel, and to the world is clear. It is stark and it is growing. The greatest danger of all is its effort over several decades to build a nuclear weapon. Iran continues to reject the resolutions of the United Nations Security Councils calling on it to suspend its uranium enrichment program, and it continues to make progress on its nuclear program, as evidenced by the recent report of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And Iran is also developing long-range ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear warheads. Just this past Saturday, just a few days ago, the head of the inspections in the Middle East for the International Atomic Energy Agency showed IAEA member nations a series of documents, a series of photographs indicating that Iran had tried to modify their long-distance missiles to carry a nuclear payload. Now Iran's missiles can already strike U.S. forces and our allies in Europe and in the Middle East, and it's only a matter of time until it has the capacity to hit us anywhere. Equally important, though often overlooked, is its status as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism and its cynical use of terror to advance its interests. The clerical regime is fomenting bloodshed and promoting chaos in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in the Persian Gulf, as well as in Iraq, where it is actively assisting in the killing of our soldiers. It also appears to be embarking upon a strategy to use its Islamic terrorist proxies not only throughout the region, not only in places like Afghanistan, but actually in Africa and even in Latin America. Tehran has already established an expanding presence in Latin America and in Africa, embracing political, economic, and military ties, as well as engaging in activities such as money laundering and acquiring weapons-related materials. More worrying is the possibility that the Islamic Republic might decide to use these footholds to destabilize other states or to launch terrorist attacks against innocent civilians abroad. One need look no further than the 1994 bombings of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires to not only understand Iran's reach half a world away, but to recognize its intent not just to target Israelis, but Jewish communities everywhere. My perspective, and one that is shared by many of my colleagues, is to impose a cost so high that it threatens the regime's survival unless it changes course. That will require imposing immediate, comprehensive, tough economic sanctions, along with every other source of pressure that we can muster, and do so in coordination with as many countries as we can persuade to do so. We can also impose pressure through such measures as publicly investigating financial institutions operating in the U.S. that are reported to be in violation of U.S. laws or UN Security Council resolutions regarding Iran. Congress can also help to ensure that those institutions which have cut off or curtailed their dealings with the Iranian regime, including refusing to issue new letters of credit to Iranian businesses, are rewarded. Where is the incentive for them to do so? Congress can support the growing effort to persuade pension funds to divest from companies that invest in Iran, which is aimed at persuading companies operating in Iran to rethink the wisdom of doing business with one of our nation's most dangerous enemies. Sanctions are among the most effective sources of pressure we have, but we have not used them to their full potential. Unfortunately, there are current efforts underway in the United States Senate to move a bill by my friend Senator Chris Dodd, which actually weakens rather than strengthens current U.S. sanctions against the Iranian regime. Sanctions that were codified or made permanent by the Iran Freedom Support Act, which I authored and which was enacted into law in September of 2006. Movement of the Dodd bill this week, at the same time that Ahmadinejad is to appear before the United Nations General Assembly, would have a crippling effect on our efforts to use economic leverage to compel Iran to dismantle its programs. I have sought to strengthen the existing sanctions of the Iran Sanctions Act, beginning in 2005 with the Iran Freedom Support Act. Last year, I joined my dear friend, the late chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Tom Lantos, and the ambassador and I were just talking about him, as the lead Republican in authoring H.R. 1400, the Iran Counter-Proliferation Act, which passed the House with a vote of 397 to 16. This legislation strengthens the Iran Sanctions Act along with other bilateral and multilateral efforts. More recently, I introduced H.R. 6178, the Security Through Termination of Proliferation Act, or STOP, which seeks to ensure that nations like the United Arab Emirates do more to ensure that they are not transshipping illegal goods that are going to or coming from Iran. Among other provisions, the bill would amend the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act to apply sanctions to persons involved in the transshipment of certain goods, services, and technology. And the reaction of the United Nations to these blatant provocations has been muted at best and non-existent at worst. Yet this reaction should not surprise us when the United Nations has yet to adequately address its own anti-Israel and anti-Semitic legacy, one that has become pervasive in many United Nations bodies and its affiliated agencies. The 1975 UN resolution equating Zionism, the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, to racism stands out as an example of this bias and outright bigotry. And while this was the most notorious illustration of its anti-Jewish sentiment at the United Nations, there have been, sadly, many others. During the 1991 session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, the Syrian representative to the UN repeated the Damascus blood libel that Jews killed Christian children to use their blood to make matzah. In 1997, the Palestinian representative charged that the Israeli government had injected 300 Palestinian children with the HIV virus. The goals of the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism were undermined by hateful anti-Jewish rhetoric, anti-Israel political agendas, promoting both Israel and the United States to withdraw our delegations from the conference. We don't tolerate anti-Israel and anti-Semitic behavior from radical Islamic Middle East tyrants, and we must not tolerate it at the United Nations, which continues to condemn the righteous and praise the wicked. Enough is enough. We must work together to stop our tax dollars from funding anti-Israel activity and anti-Semitism at and by the United Nations. And in response to the United Nations whimsically named Human Rights Council pattern of anti-Israel behavior, I offered an amendment which enjoyed strong bipartisan support and was enacted into law to prohibit all U.S. aid for this institution, the United Nations Human Rights Council, for last year. America's position must be crystal clear. We will not tolerate glorification of violent extremism and the unyielding anti-Israel rhetoric at the United Nations. I have introduced several measures to prevent any U.S. funding from supporting the so-called Durban II conference, which promises to be filled with as much hatred as the first. This summer, I held a meeting with key countries, officials from key countries, to discuss an alternative to Durban, one rooted in freedom, in tolerance, in democratic values, and our efforts continue. Unfortunately, the United Nations' rapid deterioration as a legitimate structure is not only evident in its approach to human rights, but it is rampant across the entire system. Therefore, to address the broader problems of corruption and ineffectiveness at the UN, I have introduced a bill, the United Nations Transparency, Accountability, and Reform Act, which conditions U.S. funding for the UN on clear, measurable reform of that institution. As a people who value pluralism, who value religious freedom, who value tolerance, it is no coincidence that we have been the targets of choice for extremists. We have seen that where incitement to genocide is advocated, other incendiary and extremist rhetoric flourishes as well. Thomas Jefferson said that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. It is the price of survival as well. With your help, we will maintain that vigilance, and we will help ensure that all freedom-loving people will survive and indeed prosper. Muchas gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I hope so too. I'm optimistic that yes, we can, but it can't bad timing with the financial. But it's in the CR.
I want to let you know that Professor Payam Akavan from McGill University cannot be with us today because he is occupied at the International Court of Justice defending the Republic of Georgia. So I'm sorry to say that, but I am delighted, of course, to introduce our very next speaker, who needs no introduction. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke is a man who ends wars. I would say leaps tall buildings with a single bound, but he certainly helps build tall buildings. And I know he, when I was at the State Department, was a real leader, a giant, a person who people followed because they knew he had a vision. And his vision was of a world without war, a world that is safe for people around the world. And his most recent articles, I want to just point them out to you. You should have a look at them, and we'll have copies in the back. Yesterday he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal on Iran, on this very topic that we're talking about today. And he also wrote an article in the Financial Times on the International Criminal Court's case against Bashir of Sudan. Without any further ado, I introduce to you Ambassador Richard Holbrooke.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for your kind introduction. And thank you, Dory Gold, for conceiving of this terrific conference on this important issue. I am honored to be part of it. I would be here today with our dear friend Elie Wiesel, except that last night Elie was hosting a dinner in New York for President Sarkozy, and he asked to be remembered. He is 100% behind this effort, of course, and more than anyone else we know, he embodies the point of why we're here today. And my theme is very simple, and I can encapsulate it in 2 words. Words matter. Words matter. When I hear people say, well, don't pay too much attention to what they say, they don't really mean it, my mind always goes back to my grandfather in Hamburg in 1932, 1933. He read Mein Kampf, And he took it seriously. And when many other Jews did not, saying, Hitler couldn't mean that wild, crazy stuff, my grandfather said, no, this is for real. And he gathered the children together, and he said, we are going to have to leave. I had dinner with my aunt last week, who lives in Paris now and is a very big supporter, Dory, of Tel Aviv University, very big friend of Itamar Rabinowitz. And I said, just go over this for me. She was very young at the time. But I said, how did it work out? And he said, well, he sent the children out immediately, first to Switzerland and then to Buenos Aires. My family was fortunate. They had enough means to get out. But many other people who had the means or the ability to get out didn't, for the simplest reason. They didn't think Hitler really meant it. And of course, we all know what happened. Bad history leads to bad events. In the book that I wrote on the Bosnian negotiations, I addressed this. When I got first involved in Bosnia, the prevailing wisdom, most epitomized by the Secretary of State under George Bush Sr., Larry Eagleburger, was that these were ancient hatreds. Eagleburger, who had served as United States ambassador in Yugoslavia, had the audacity to say, we, the outside world, can do nothing about this until they are tired of killing each other. I work closely with Larry Eagleburger. I understand what a distinguished diplomat he is, but I don't think history should be very forgiving of a callous, cynical, and factually inaccurate statement such as that. He said, let them kill each other till they're worn out. We all know where that would have ended. When President Clinton took office, his Secretary of State, his first Secretary of State, said similar things, using phrases like ancient hatreds and the problem from hell. And it wasn't until the summer of 1995 that President Clinton belatedly got engaged. And when the U.S. engaged, we were able to stop the fighting, bring the parties to the table at Dayton, Ohio, behind a high barbed wire fence at Wright-Patterson Air Base, and force them to an agreement. That agreement was not perfect. I want to stress that to you. But it ended the war. It ended the genocide. To this day, parties on both sides, but particularly the Bosnian Muslims, are seeking justice through the International Court of Justice and through other means. And they should continue to do that. But the important thing was that the genocide was stopped. In Darfur today, the International Criminal Court has said that there are grounds to indict the president of Sudan, President Bashir. This is the article I wrote in yesterday's Financial Times, which I hope will be available to you by the end of this meeting. And now the members of the Security Council are talking about exercising their authority under the Rome Treaty, the treaty that set up the International Criminal Court. They're talking about using their authority to delay action for at least 12 months. In the article I wrote in yesterday's Financial Times, I strongly oppose that. On the simplest grounds, Bashir hasn't indicated that a delay would improve the situation or that he would change his tactics. If somebody could come forward and say, give him 12 months and he'll stop it, we in the international community would have to consider it, even though it would be giving leeway to a war criminal, because lives that are still alive might be saved. But to give him an extension based on nothing, which is what China and Russia and some of the Europeans are now thinking about, just weakens the whole concept of the International Criminal Court. It weakens the concept of the Genocide Convention, and it weakens the pressure of the international community. If a person is guilty of genocide, that person should be held accountable for that because words matter. And so we come, of course, to the issue of Iran. Dory Gold and his colleagues have done an absolutely brilliant job of bringing this to world attention. Now, because the Iranian nuclear program is the front edge of every news story, and because everyone takes for granted Ahmadinejad's odious statements about Israel, people haven't focused enough yet on the core underlying reason that Iran with a nuclear weapon is uniquely dangerous. I don't want Pakistan to have a bomb. They already have one. I certainly don't want North Korea to have a bomb. They have built 6 or 7 in the last few years. I don't want to see proliferation. But Iran is uniquely dangerous because of the specific threats they have issued to another country. Threats based on religion and ethnicity. Threats based absolutely clearly on genocide under its legal definition. I'm going to leave the legal discussions to the subsequent speakers. Gregory Gordon is going to be speaking, Dory will be speaking, and you have these fabulous books. But I do want to underscore that in 1948 a convention was passed, which the United States, by the way, ratified after a long 40-year delay. And the name of that convention was, we all call it the Genocide Convention, but I want to give you the full title of the Genocide Convention so you understand why we're here today. It is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. These books that you have today point out that historically genocide is only something that is discovered after it has happened. And then people go back and dig into the archives, as they're doing about Armenia still today, or about what happened during the Holocaust, or what happened in Darfur. But this convention is called Prevention and Punishment, and let's stress the word prevention right now. Then, in the last few years, the International Criminal Court was established. Unfortunately, the United States, under this administration, withdrew President Clinton's signature from the ICC convention, and therefore we are not a signatory to it. More importantly, Iran is not a signatory, and I must also note for the record that Israel is not a signatory. Nonetheless, it is a treaty in force, and a very important one. Subsequent speakers will explain to you how it can apply specifically to this case. Because under the Rome Treaty, that's the name of the treaty that established the International Criminal Court, under the Rome Treaty, there are provisions, particularly Article 25, subparagraph 3E, that clearly cover, explicitly cover, the Genocide Convention. So, what can we do about it? Ahmadinejad is in New York today speaking at the United Nations the same morning we're assembled here. There's nothing we can do to stop him speaking at the UN. It is a sacred and critical right that the United Nations be a forum even for the most odious people, and I have never supported those people who want to ban him from New York simply because we would damage ourselves. However, I do not think that it is wise to invite him to address other fora. As chairman of Asia Society, I am chairman of the great organization headquartered in New York with a very strong regional presence here in Washington. We were offered a chance to have Ahmadinejad before Columbia University and before the Council on Foreign Relations 2 years ago. And we turned them down. And I want to explain why we turned them down. It is not because I'm afraid that Ahmadinejad's words would somehow change anyone's opinion here in the U.S. It's because he uses these forums to legitimize himself in Iran. And that's why Columbia was wrong, and that's why other institutions that invite him are wrong. It doesn't matter if he gets up and makes a fool of himself, as he did at Columbia when he said, in answer to a question, that there were no homosexuals in Iran. That's irrelevant. What's important is that by appearing before a great institution, he can go back home and say, you see, I can command the world stage. We need to isolate him. We need to marginalize him. We need the other people in Iran to recognize that he is an embarrassment to his own country. 2/3 of the people in Iran don't like him much. 2/3 of the people want a reformist government. The economy is a mess except for $120 oil. There are many vulnerabilities of this man. And we all know that he doesn't even run the country. That's the supreme leader. And we know also that the rest of the Iranian leadership is also anti-Israeli. But by singling out Ahmadinejad, who is after all the president, i.e. the chief of state, if not the most powerful person in the country. By the way, that's also true in Russia, as you may have noticed. The real power is not President Medvedev, who's also in New York today. The real power is Vladimir Putin. But by singling out Ahmadinejad on this issue, we send a signal to the whole Iranian leadership that their ties to Hezbollah and Hamas and their efforts to promulgate this kind of stuff will not sell internationally. And so I applaud tremendously this group. Again, I stress, there's no way you can stop him from talking at the UN General Assembly. But to give him other fora just don't make any sense to me. We want to generate an intense debate, starting here and now, over Tehran's statements towards Israel, recognizing always that what you say today can turn into a policy tomorrow. We want them to understand that they too could face the isolation that comes from actions from something like the International Criminal Court. Another reason why all of us in this room should tell everyone in the international community, particularly in the Security Council, not to defer Bashir's indictment. Think of the effect in Tehran if we defer Bashir's indictment or we allow it to happen. It's a very tricky technical issue and there are a lot of nuances, but in the end, we shouldn't let a person advocating genocide off the hook. And what happens to Bashir will affect the attitude in Tehran. We need to use all international pressure to put on Tehran. And again, I want to conclude with the simplest point, just 2 words. Words really matter. And I congratulate my friend Dori Gold, who was my counterpart as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations when I served there. I want to congratulate Irwin and Gordon, both Gordons, I guess. We got 2 Gordons. No, excuse me, 2 Gregorys. No Gordons. The Gordon didn't come, right?
I'm Gregory Gordon.
Oh, we have 1 Gordon and 2 Gregorys out of 2 people. I want to congratulate Dori and both Gregorys, and in the name of my dear friend and all of our friend Elie Wiesel, who would say it much more eloquently, words matter, and I congratulate you on this effort, and I will be with you at your side as we continue this fight. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Holbrooke, for those very sobering remarks. The speaker I want to introduce next is a man that I have known, I think, since 1994. When we were looking around for people to be prosecutors at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, I was the person in the State Department and the International Organizations Bureau who was doing some of the looking. And we called over the Justice Department and we said, we need a really tough guy to go out there as a prosecutor. And they said, well, we have a couple of those people. And one of them is this guy here, Greg Gordon. He went out to the Rwanda Tribunal, which was one of the real path-breaking tribunals in defining the law of genocide, and most recently has really defined the law of incitement to genocide in the media case. I will share with you just one anecdote about that whole process. We had actually managed to collect the tapes of the broadcasts of Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines. That is the hate radio in Rwanda at the time. And they had been delivered to my office. And we needed to, and this lawyers will understand this, establish a clean chain of custody for these tapes to get to that tribunal. And so I literally handed the box with those tapes to Greg Gordon to take out to Arusha with him, and that is how the clean chain of custody was established for that evidence that was used so effectively by him and by others in that tribunal. Greg has put together a really masterful analysis of the case for incitement to genocide that has been committed by the Iranian regime and by President Ahmadinejad. And I am going to, without any further ado then, introduce to you the Professor of International Law at the University of North Dakota, former prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, Professor Greg Gordon.
Well, I think we had a very good introduction to the problem that we're dealing with. As Ambassador Holbrooke says, words matter. I would add that, in fact, words kill. And the question I want to address is, what are the legal tools that we have to deal with the problem? And I want to focus specifically on the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide. There is also the possibility of crimes against humanity. I'm not going to go into that today, but I'm going to focus on incitement to genocide. I want to talk about some of the mechanics of the crime and its origins, and a little bit about the Rwandan cases that Professor Stanton just mentioned. So let me kind of launch into the origins of the crime, which we see through the Nuremberg, the famous Nuremberg Trial, in particular the case against Julius Streicher, the publisher of that horrific publication known as Der Stürmer. And the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg found that his incitement to exterminate Jews, murder and exterminate them at a time when they were being killed in the East under the most horrible conditions, clearly constitutes persecution on political and racial grounds in connection with war crimes as defined by the International Military Tribunal Charter, and constitutes a crime against humanity. Now, you'll note that at this point we are talking about a crime against humanity. This is 1946. And as Ambassador Holbrooke just mentioned, the Genocide Convention is going to come along soon thereafter in 1948. And that's where we see the specific origins of the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide. We begin with Article 2. Article 2 is what defines genocide. We've heard a little bit about it from our first two speakers, but it's a series of acts, including, for example, killing and causing serious bodily or mental harm, committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. That's the basic definition of genocide that many of us now have come to understand through a series of cases that fortunately we've had a chance to develop the jurisprudence over the last decade. We go further in looking at Article 3. Article 3 then states that a number of related acts committed in furtherance of Article 2 shall also be punishable. This includes, at Article 3b, direct and public incitement to commit genocide. So we see in Articles 2 and Article 3 the fundamental law related to direct and public incitement to genocide. Professor Stanton talked about my work with the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and at the ICTR, what happened was, and actually Professor Stanton worked on this statute himself, so he knows very well, that the elements of direct and public incitement to genocide, indeed genocide in general, were taken from the Genocide Convention and put into the ICTR statute. Article 2.3c of the ICTR statute is what I'd like to direct your attention to. It essentially mirrors Article 3b of the Genocide Convention, and so the jurisprudence related to incitement to genocide from the ICTR is extremely helpful in interpreting Article 3b of the Genocide Convention. And in fact, a number of defendants have been convicted, prosecuted and convicted of direct and public incitement to genocide. I would like to now focus on 4 of the key cases from the ICTR, and then I'm going to talk as well about a Canadian case which also interprets the ICTR jurisprudence. So these cases that we can look at to really flesh out what we mean by the crime of direct and public incitement to commit genocide are the first major case from the ICTR, the Akayesu case. Akayesu was a mayor or bourgmestre in the Taba commune in Rwanda. He was the first person at the ICTR to go to trial, and I'll talk a little bit about what he did in a moment, but he was essentially the leader of this town when the genocide started, and he gave a speech where he spoke to militias about the Tutsis, and Tutsis were in fact massacred. The prime minister of what I would call the rump government in Rwanda during the genocide, Jean Kambanda, spoke in various crowds about the Tutsis and used language that was inciting, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. He also spoke on the radio. So the leader of Rwanda was going around and fomenting this hatred and this violence, and his case has contributed to the jurisprudence. Georges Ruju, who was the only European to be prosecuted and convicted by the ICTR, was a Belgian national who went to Rwanda and became a radio announcer for the infamous Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, which Professor Stanton mentioned a moment ago. Many of you have heard of it. Any of you who've seen the movie Hotel Rwanda know that the movie starts with a broadcast from RTLM. RTLM was on the airwaves constantly through the genocide, exhorting people to commit violence, locating individuals for murder, and speaking about hatred in a way that whipped up the population into a frenzy and allowed the genocide to take place. And one of its most prominent announcers was Georges Ruju. Given the fact that he was European and he was white, he had a lot of authority in that country. He pled guilty to incitement to genocide. And I have to say that's one of my proudest accomplishments at the tribunal because we were talking about possibly letting him go due to lack of evidence. And we hunkered down with the investigators and we put together an indictment against him and he pled guilty. So it's an important case. Another one, and probably the most important as far as fleshing out the elements of incitement to genocide, is the so-called media case against Ferdinand Nahimana, who was the intellectual darling of the extremist Hutus, and many consider really the founder of RTLM, Jean Bosco Barreguiza, who was another influential extremist Hutu leader, and also a founder of RTLM, and Hassan Ngezi, who was editor-in-chief of Kangura, the newspaper that was most responsible, perhaps during the genocide, for spreading the message of hate. The other case, as I mentioned, that bears emphasis is the case against Leon Mugucera. It's a 2005 case from the Supreme Court of Canada, and it was decided in the immigration context, but it applies the ICTR standards for incitement to genocide. He was a Hutu extremist politician who gave an infamous speech in November of 1992 indicating that Tutsis should go back to supposedly their country of origin, Ethiopia, via the Nyabarongo River, which is a non-navigable river and which was unfortunately a place where many corpses were placed during the genocide. He went through deportation proceedings and went all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court, and we have some helpful jurisprudence from that case. From these cases, we have been able to establish what the basic elements of incitement are, and I've tried to put them in a way that would be hopefully understandable. One of the things we always need to ask is where the utterance was issued. Is it sufficiently public? Is it sufficiently public? Secondly, we want to focus on its interpretation by the audience. Is it sufficiently direct? Third, we must consider its content. Is it permissible free speech, which is something that we cherish greatly in this country, and we have to be very vigilant and careful about not infringing on free speech rights? Or is it criminal incitement? Because there is a difference. And then finally, what is the state of mind of the person uttering the words? Is there sufficient intent? And let me try to flesh some of these things out for you. But before I do that, I want to mention some collateral principles that have come out of these cases that I think are helpful to be aware of. The official position of the speaker will not shield him from liability, as the Kambanda case demonstrates nicely. Employing euphemisms. Euphemisms, not using necessarily direct words such as go out and kill, but for example, in the context of the Rwandan genocide, talking about going to work. Those sorts of euphemisms do not necessarily affect the directness calculus. And I'll mention that in connection with the Kambanda and Ruju cases. And then whether the incitement leads to actual violence is of no moment. It is not important because causation is not an element. This is a huge point. Causation is not an element. Let me talk about each of these elements in connection with these cases. Now, as I mentioned, in the case of Akiezu, he was at a meeting where he called on town residents to unite so they could eliminate what he described as the sole enemy, the accomplices of the Inkotanyi, which is a word, Inkotanyi, traditionally associated with Tutsi warriors, kind of a generic word talking about Tutsi warriors. Soon after this exhortation, the town's Tutsis were in fact massacred. So that's the basic setup of Akiezu. He's charged with direct and public incitement to commit genocide. And in convicting him, the ICTR fleshes out some very important elements: intent, public, and direct. Let's take a look at how they do it. First of all, with respect to intent, the person who incites others to commit genocide must himself have the specific intent to commit genocide. namely to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. We remember that from Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. And of course, intent can be inferred from the circumstances it most typically is. People don't typically say, you know, I want to commit genocide and here's why. You have to look at all the circumstantial evidence and you put it together. The next important element is public. That's fairly straightforward. Incitement is public if it constitutes a call, either one, for criminal action to a number of individuals in a public place, or two, to members of the general public at large by means of mass media, for example, radio or television, and that's the situation we had with RTLM. Direct is, of course, a huge question, and the direct element of incitement should be viewed in the light of its cultural and linguistic content. You have to consider what's going on in the specific place at the specific time within the culture of that people. So words like work, for example, take on a special meaning, or inkotani. So while a particular speech may be perceived as direct in one country, it would not necessarily be considered so in another country. As a result, it is very important to conduct a case-by-case inquiry, and the issue that you want to resolve is whether the persons for whom the message was intended immediately grasped the implication thereof. The person immediately grasped the implications of the message. There's an application of the direct element that is important for me to mention. Both expert, in other words, a sociolinguist, which is what we used in the media case in Rwanda. I actually found Matthias Rusandana and worked with him and prepared him for trial. He testified what some of these words meant, and it was very important to the success of the prosecution. Fact witnesses, citizens in Rwanda who heard these words on the radio, they could testify as to what they thought these words meant. So you're going to be using witnesses for this. In Akiyezu's speech, these witnesses were used, and, for example, the word inkotani was found through this testimony to mean all Tutsis. So, as a result, the tribunal was able to find that contextually, Akiyezu urged the killing of all Tutsis in Taba when he talked about the Inkotani. Kambanda announced repeatedly during the genocide, "You refuse to give your blood to your country, and the dogs drink it for nothing." And this was found to be incitement to genocide, we can see that he's speaking in metaphors. People who incite to genocide use metaphors. That is primarily their tool. And so the Kambanda case establishes that nicely, especially with this particular phrase. Code words as well. For example, Ruju talked about finishing off the 1959 revolution. And those of you who know something about Rwandan history know that there were terrible massacres against the Tutsis in 1959. And within that context, that was understood to be a call to massacre the Tutsi population. Within the context of the 1994 Civil War, the word inyenzi, which means cockroach, a very derogatory and dehumanizing term, was understood to mean Tutsi. And that was used repeatedly by Ruju, and that was part of why he was convicted. Now, of course, the big case in this area is the media case. And the two big issues that get resolved are content and causation. And remember, when I talked about content, the issue was, is this a permissible exercise of free speech? Or do we have something that has eroded into hate speech that is, in fact, criminal incitement? And I hate to give you all these elements, but this is a complicated area of the law, and I need for you to understand that when you try to analyze whether or not content is a permissible exercise of free speech or illegal incitement, you have to look at these elements based on the media case decision. Purpose, text, context, and the relationship between the speaker and the subject. Now, I will tell you, if you look at the opinion itself, that you're only going to see 2 or 3 of these, but I have tried to put some gloss on the opinion, and this is my interpretation of what the test calls for. Purpose is probably the most complicated of once we're in this area of the issues that we have to resolve. There are two extremes that we can look at. Of course, there are very legitimate endeavors, such as historical research, dissemination of news and information, public accountability of government authorities. Those are obviously legitimate exercises of free speech. At the other end of the spectrum, however, we have a clearly illegitimate objective, which is explicit calls for violence. And we have examples of that in our TLM. We have announcers like Cantano Habimana saying, go find somebody who's tall and skinny and a narrow nose, somebody who would fit the stereotypical description of a Tutsi, and essentially kill him. But then there's that area in between. And there's kind of a twilight zone of hate speech not explicitly calling for violence, and where a finder of fact is going to have to go through and do the hard work. But the RTLM decision gives us some guidance. For example, there's an instance in the decision where Barre Aguiza, one of the people who was being prosecuted, talked about his experience growing up as a Hutu, being dispossessed and having a difficult life. And the tribunal found that that was a legitimate case of raising ethnic awareness. Nonviolent metaphors were sometimes used, for example, by Kangura. There's an article titled, A Cockroach Cannot Give Birth to a Butterfly, talking about Tutsis and Hutus and Tutsis being cockroaches. That was found not to be incitement to genocide. On the other hand, indirect calls, which I say would fall on the bottom of the spectrum where we have illegitimate objectives, those can be incitement to genocide. So, for example, predictions of destruction, which is something that we're going to hear about more in the Ahmadinejad case. Accusing people of committing crimes to the point where you're raising fear in the listener and in that way urging that there be violence against the people who are supposedly committing the violence. Often also referred to as accusations in a mirror. Those sorts of things, those do represent instances of incitement. And then using code words like go to work and things like that. Those are also, while not direct, those are incitement. It's important to look at the words. Has the speaker distanced himself from the hate message by using pejorative adjectives to describe a point of view? For example, talking about a point of view and referring to the person having it as a hate monger or a racist. Look at the words from a country's lexicon to describe or dehumanize a victim, such as cockroach. Those are really important. And then, of course, context. You want to consider the external context. Is there a war going on? Are there cases of ethnic violence that are already there? And then internal context. What's the tone of voice of the speaker? What history does this speaker have of making similar statements? In the case of Ahmadinejad, I think it's very important to look at context and to look at his long string of statements calling for the destruction of Israel in so many different ways. And then finally, what's the relationship between the speaker and the subject? The analysis should be more speech protective when the speaker is part of a minority criticizing either the government or the country's majority population. So I've heard people say, for example, about the ICTR media decision, my God, with this decision, somebody like Bob Dylan would have been prosecuted in the 60s for his war protest songs. That's not true, because I think the analysis tells us that someone like Bob Dylan in that situation is probably going to be accorded more protection. The analysis, of course, will be less speech protective in the converse situation. So when you have somebody like Ahmadinejad, who represents the government of Iran, or somebody like Nahimana, who is working with the government in Rwanda, or Kambanda himself, they represent the majority Hutus, the government, and they are trying to kill Tutsis. That is going to be less protected. And then finally, of course, causation. And as I mentioned, the crime of direct and public incitement to genocide does not have a causation element within it. It is in what we call in the law an inchoate crime. So, in other words, you don't have to have a situation where genocide actually takes place for the crime to have been committed. If you satisfy the other elements that I just mentioned, and there is no genocide that follows, you've still committed the crime. Now, it's important that those other elements be satisfied, of course, and I think the fact that those elements will be satisfied will give us some measure of comfort that we are not simply prosecuting people who are exercising legitimate free speech rights, but we don't need to have a genocide in order to be able to prosecute somebody for direct and public incitement to genocide. We have got to learn that genocide does not take place without incitement. It is an essential element that is important in Professor Stanton's work. He really should be up here speaking because he's a pioneer in this area, and we should applaud his efforts. He's really been a trailblazer. But that, I think, is the message. We do not need to show consequent violence. It's the mere potential of the communication to cause genocide that makes it a crime. And then the Mugucera case, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's really a capstone. It takes all the elements from the Rwandan ICTR jurisprudence, and it puts it into a very good framework where you can see how it's applied. And it's very helpful, I think, because Mugucera made his speech in November 1992. The genocide started in April of 1994. So Mugucera really very nicely illustrates the fact that you do not have to have the causation element there. There was ethnic violence going on against the Hutu, against the Tutsis in November 1992 when Mugucera made his speech. That was good enough to find that he had committed incitement to genocide. Let me just conclude by noting again the fact that given that the crime is inchoate and causation is not a requirement, incitement to genocide should focus on its intended mission. Its intended mission, which is prevention as opposed to mere punishment. It should be a preventive tool. And I will end with a quote by David Matas, who's a great human rights advocate and scholar, that incitement to genocide as a crime means resorting to legal institutions rather than using force. It means acting when there is still time rather than after it is too late. And for those of you in the audience today and those of you with me on this panel who are working to prevent genocide, we've got to remember this, and I am so grateful to be working with you on this issue because you will help make a difference. You really will. And I'm glad that I could be with you today and explain these important principles. Thank you very much.
We'll have time after Ambassador Gold has spoken to have some discussion and questions. Dr. Dory Gold is really the force behind this conference. Believe me, I know what a force he is. It's remarkable. And he, I think, among all of the people here, has paid the most attention to the incitements by the President of Iran. And his institute, the Jerusalem Institute, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, has done the best job of analyzing the meaning of the words that President Ahmadinejad has been using, calling for the destruction of Israel. You know, one of the most common parts of the genocidal process is denial. I consider it one of the 8 basic stages of genocide. And it begins from the beginning. Right now, we are in the middle of a situation of denial in which a lot of people don't want to believe that President Ahmadinejad is really meaning what he's saying. Just the way a lot of people denied that Adolf Hitler was meaning what he said in Mein Kampf, as Ambassador Holbrooke said. Well, we better start listening, because he does mean it. And if we don't take action now to try to stop it, it could in fact turn into another Holocaust. And that is what this marvelous, dynamic former ambassador, Israeli ambassador to the UN, and head of the President of Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, has called us to do today. So I'm, without further ado, going to then introduce Ambassador Dori Gold.
This conference is becoming a mutual admiration society with a lot of compliments that are deserved to a number of people. Greg, if you have a chance to share with us some of your experiences from the Cambodian genocide, in between things, your insights would be tremendously useful to all of us. And I have to say that before I met Gregory Gordon, I read his law review article, and in it he links all this professional experience from the Rwanda case, where he was a real pioneer, to the Iranian case. So if any of you have questions about how that legal analysis fits in with the Iranian case, I strongly suggest it. And finally, of course, Professor Irwin Cutler, Member of Parliament of Canada, has led the way. When we were starting to do our work in Jerusalem, we turned to him for advice and analysis, and at the end of today we're going to have a groundbreaking paper released of his, which just takes this to the next stage in terms that anyone who's ever served in the UN would understand, and I think any reasonable citizen would understand. Let me begin by just making two observations. Number one, everyone knows that the President of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, is speaking in the General Assembly today. And we are in the middle of a very great struggle. A struggle over who he is and what his role is. Ahmadinejad will try in the next few days to meet with the American press in his hotel. There were rumors a few days ago that he is planning to also receive delegations from the Mennonite Church and the Quakers who want to break bread with him. I know that the Anti-Defamation League issued some very strong statements when that came about, when that was first mentioned. And clearly, he is trying, by his meetings with the press in New York and with his meeting with church leaders, to try and become a legitimate world leader. He appears in the UN General Assembly. He's legitimized by the people and organizations that accept him. And that's how he wants to be viewed. But the question is, if indeed the repeated statements of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad since the year 2005 amount to a violation of the anti-incitement clauses of the Genocide Convention, then he should not be in the box of the legitimate leader. He should be in the box of a war criminal. And I'm saying that regardless of if we ever get to a point of seeing him sit in the chair of Milosevic in The Hague. Clearly you can't have a Security Council recommendation to the International Court of Justice with the Chinese and the Russians sitting there blocking any effective action. But the question is how we in the international community relate to him in light of his statements. Now, Professor Greg Stanton made a very important remark, which I want to pick up from, that there are a lot of people who don't want to believe that Ahmadinejad has said the things he has said. They prefer to confess that they don't believe that that is his intent. Back in October of this year, I was invited by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy to a meeting at the Lansdowne Conference Center. And it was a fascinating meeting because he brought together experts on the Middle East with advisors to each of the U.S. presidential candidates. In those days, you had Giuliani represented, you had everybody who was Edwards, a person was there. And we had an opportunity to chat and see and discuss what was going on in the Middle East and what were the various policies that the various candidates and political parties were considering. And I was sitting next to one gentleman with a tremendous amount of diplomatic experience, and I showed him a book we had done at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, which was our first attempt to analyze Ahmadinejad and the Genocide Convention. And while we were sitting there bored listening to a speaker, he pulled out his BlackBerry and he showed me an article from Salon magazine, not exactly foreign affairs, but in the article it was argued that Ahmadinejad was mistranslated, that he didn't intend to destroy Israel physically, and that this was part of a campaign to distort his language. The fact that I'm sitting at a meeting with advisors to presidential candidates, somebody takes out his BlackBerry and shows me an article saying we don't understand Ahmadinejad, that flashed a red light in my head. I said, even if he doesn't fully believe the article from Slate magazine, nonetheless, the magazine and a number of other statements cast a doubt in the minds of very smart observers of whether we should be as concerned with Ahmadinejad as we are. Maybe we're exaggerating. That could be a conclusion that would be put forward. So what I did is I went back to Israel, and I run a research institute called the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Part of what you have to do is decide where you're going to devote your resources. And I put together a team of Farsi experts in the Persian language. And we downloaded everything we could get off of Iranian websites to see what Ahmadinejad has said, to see what other leaders have said in Iran, and to see whether this was just loose talk or something that might fit into the rubrics that Professor Gregory Gordon was speaking about. And let me share with you a couple of our conclusions. One of the claims that is made from time to time among those who try to excuse Ahmadinejad's language is to say that, look, he wasn't talking about destroying Israel. The statement he made, and by the way, the exact statement which we had very carefully translated was, our dear Imam Khomeini, this is from 2005, ordered that this Jerusalem occupying regime must be erased from the page of time. This is a very wise statement. That is exactly what he said, word for word. They said, they're talking about the regime. They're not talking about the state of Israel. He is not talking about the state of Israel. He's talking about the regime. Therefore, what he wants is regime change. A political change, but not a physical destruction of the state of Israel. And he's not talking about Israel as a whole. He's only talking about the government, not the people as a whole. Well, to share with you, one of the things we did beside collecting information is we also went into Persian websites, Iranian websites, in order to collect how Iranians understand, something Professor Gordon raised. We went into blogs. We went into to download photographs. I'm going to ask that the AV people put up photograph number 1. This is a photograph. The translator is not the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. The translation is provided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Israel should be wiped out of the face of the world. This is from the headquarters of the Basij. The Basij are the volunteer units of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran. This is from a building in Tehran, which we believe is their headquarters. And you can see, this is not the Zionist regime. Those who read Arabic, it's the same as in Persian, Israel. So it is the state, the whole entity. And of course should be wiped out of the face of the world, which is one of the varying translations of the same thing that Ahmadinejad has said. So we're not talking about regime or government, as has been argued by some of these experts who do not want to believe that Ahmadinejad is calling for the destruction of Israel. This is Israel that should be wiped out. And when I spoke, I remember when this first came up, and we were first discussing this with Irwin Cutler, Irwin made a very important statement. You can't wipe a country off a map without wiping the people who live there. And so it's clear that he's speaking about Israel. Now, another claim made by those who don't want to believe that Ahmadinejad is talking about the physical destruction of Israel is that he's talking about a historical process. And when he talks about Israel being decaying and it's about to be dissolve and all the language he's used repeatedly since 2005, he has in mind the model of the Soviet Union. In other words, the Soviet Union was full of internal contradictions. It fell apart. It was replaced with another governmental authority, Russia and the CIS states. And so all he's doing is characterizing a historical process. This has nothing to do with physical destruction. And therefore it's not incitement to genocide. That's the argument made by those who doubt that this is as serious as I believe it is. So one of the things we did, we of course accumulated a large number of statements, and we have seen characterizations that go beyond just a historical process, but characterizations that go to actual physical destruction. And I think one of the most useful is to just show you another photograph, which actually goes back a few years prior to Ahmadinejad's first statement, because after all, these statements reflect the attitude and the quotations of Ayatollah Khomeini, and statements that were made by the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. What you have here is a photograph from Iranian television, and what you have is the statement, Israel must be uprooted and wiped off the pages of history. Now, I know this is unclear because this is a photograph from a television. This is a television image from September 22nd, 2003. And that billboard, which talks about wiping Israel off the pages of history, is next to and adjacent to a Shihab-3 missile. The missile developed by Iran, which has a 1,300-kilometer range and at present is capable of striking Israel. It is also our concern that the Iranians have been working on the Shihab-3 nose cone so that it can be outfitted with a nuclear weapon in the future. Therefore, rather than this being just a statement of some kind of historical inevitability, a kind of Iranian study in the durability of the Zionist movement, what we have here is a clear juxtaposition of the statement with the weapon to carry out the statement. So we're not talking about political theory, we're speaking about something else. I should say in the last 2 days, the Los Angeles Times also carried a sermon given by Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, in a Friday sermon in Tehran just a few days ago. And in it, Ali Khamenei made clear that the problem that Iran has is not just with the government of Israel, but with the people of Israel as well. This further reconfirms the fact that we're not talking about regimes, we're not talking about regime change, and we're not just talking about historical processes. I could go on with this, but we actually have an excellent booklet that we've put out. I asked Josh Teitelbaum of the Dayan Center for Middle East Studies to put this booklet together, and I suggest there are a number of them. If you see them, I would suggest you grab it and look it over, because all this analysis of the Farsi language and of the photographs and blog entries is there. I have to add in 2 other statements. In Israel, we also closely monitor an organization that's just north of us. It's called Hezbollah. Hezbollah is many times incorrectly seen in America as an authentic Lebanese grassroots Shiite movement. We view Hezbollah as an extension of Iran, as simply another unit of the Iranian armed forces. And the reason for that is we know how Hezbollah was established. It was established by the Iranian ambassador to Damascus in the early 1980s, and it is sustained and maintained by Iran. One of the key points in Professor Gordon's presentation was how people who are in the hierarchy of the system understand the statements of the leadership. And therefore, it was very important for us to see that already in 2002, Hassan Nasrallah made a statement, which we had heard about for many years. It had been popping up in various Beirut newspapers. One of our analysts, Lieutenant Colonel Reserves Yonatan Dachoach Halevi, went into the Hezbollah archives and there they have the actual audio. There's an audio archive, and you can download it and listen to it. And I just want you to hear what Hassan Nasrallah said. Again, when a major ideological statement comes out of Hezbollah, if indeed Hezbollah is an extension of Iran, then this is simply a reflection of how Hezbollah understands Iran's ideology. He made the following statement: Islamic prophecies, and not only Jewish prophecies, declare that this state, meaning Israel, will come into being, and that all the Jews of the world will gather from all corners of the world in occupied Palestine. But this will not be so that their false Messiah, in Arabic known as the Dajjal, can rule the world, but so that God can save you the trouble of running them down all over the world. And then the battle will be decisive and crushing. This is not against the regime. This is not even just against the Jews living in Israel. This is against the Jewish people as a whole. And it's a statement made by a man who was a direct protege of the Iranian regime. Let me conclude by saying this. We've made presentations today about Iran, but it would be wrong for me to just come to a conference on the Genocide Convention and say, here's our problem, help us with this struggle. We have to, and I think, I say this as a former Israeli ambassador and as a Jew, I think the issue of genocide and genocide prevention is our subject. And it's our subject not only in relationship to our security, it's our subject in relationship to global security. And therefore, when we hear about genocide in Darfur, we have a responsibility to express ourselves and to act. I remember when I served in the UN, the Rwandan ambassador came to me and said, you know, we've heard about your Yad Vashem, how you tried to create a museum for encapsulating and presenting the history of the Holocaust. Maybe you can help us. We have a responsibility to do that. And if we see there's early warning about genocide that's about to occur anywhere in the world, we have a responsibility to lend our voice to preventing that genocide from occurring. So we're here in Washington to raise awareness to the issue of Ahmadinejad because he's in the UN today. But we also have a responsibility to fight genocide and incitement to genocide wherever it occurs. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Ambassador Gold and Greg Gordon, Professor Gordon, to answer questions and make comments on your comments for about 15 minutes now, so that we can have a little bit of discussion here, if you'd like to do that. If there are people who'd like to make comments, and Dick Hellman, yes.
We worked for approximately 2 years to try to get some recognition by the administration, or more directly by the House and Senate, of the whole issue of incitement to genocide by President Ahmadinejad of Iran. That's resulted in the passage of H-Con Res 21, 411-2, January 20th of 2007. So my question would be, how important do you and panelists feel it is that the Senate, particularly the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, report out and that the Senate pass a companion measure to House Concurrent Resolution 21, which flagged this whole issue of incitement to genocide by President Ahmadinejad.
First of all, I would like to commend Dick Hellman and the work of his organization in helping lobby for that legislation. We were speaking about a decision of the U.S. House of Representatives last June, which determined that indeed Ahmadinejad's rhetoric calling for wiping Israel off the map amounts to a violation of the Genocide Convention. And when the House of Representatives gives its voice, that has enormous moral power. I can say this, that when we started our campaign on this issue back at the end of 2006, we first went to the New York Bar Association with our ideas. Then I took a delegation to the British House of Commons. And at that time, Irwin was our most eloquent speaker with the legal analysis, but we were joined by very important people in England. And from the State of Israel, the head of our opposition, Benjamin Netanyahu, joined us for the presentations in London and added a kind of high level to our access in the British government. After our presentations in London, about 70 members of the British House of Commons signed on to an early morning bill, which is a kind of special bill for backbenchers in the House of Commons. I go into that detail for a very specific reason. The more we have voices around the world who agree with this, the more power there will be to this idea. The not so much recently elected, but already he's been in power, the Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, in fact made a public statement right before his election. He said, "I support the idea of Irwin Cutler and Dory Gold to seek the indictment of Ahmadinejad." And then he became elected Prime Minister of Australia, and the Australians have been considering how to follow up with his policy statements. So if the Australians make a statement, I know that Irwin Cutler, as a member of Parliament in Canada, and he'll give you the details, has made sure that one of the key committees in the Canadian Parliament passed a resolution on this very point. So if the House of Representatives has made a move, and as I guess in the course of things in the U.S. government, the House resolution is reported to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, it would be a tremendous contribution to the international consensus against Ahmadinejad that the Senate, U.S. Senate, also vote on a similar resolution.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm Dan Pollack with the Zionist Organization of America. What would be the legal precedent implications of not moving forward with an indictment against Ahmadinejad, given that he has made all these statements? What does that do to all the precedents you showed us about Rwanda? I guess you made the claim, this is a legal question, I guess, you made the claim that even if they don't actually do the genocide, the act of advocating it is itself a crime. But if it's never indicted, does it still continue to be a crime?
Well, I regret to say that there's a lot of crime out there in the world that doesn't get indicted. It's unfortunate, but it doesn't change what the law is. I don't think there's any question that we're seeing legal violations. But what I do think we have to recognize is that we have reigning in the world a culture of impunity. And I think if this stands and he continues to make these kinds of horrible statements and nothing is done, that it, of course, will contribute to the culture of impunity. But I think more importantly, there is a speech component to the culture of impunity, which in action in the Ahmadinejad case will certainly be bolstered. And I would really hate to think about the consequences of that, because it could set a precedent as far as what world leaders think they can get away with. But I think the indictment of Bashir, I think the conviction of Kambanda and people like that, it gives us some hope that the world will come to its senses. And I think the Security Council resolutions issued against Ahmadinejad, as well as the support of the U.S. Congress, the Parliament in Great Britain, Kevin Rudd in Australia, and all that, will help bring people around to realizing that we do have to do something. But I don't think it will take away from the precedent that's been established by the Rwandan cases. That will stand. It's just a matter of whether it gets used.
Eric.
Do you
failure of 30 years of relatively hardline policies of the United States against Iran that possibly boosting our relations with Iran would have a possibility of affecting a positive change in the political, social, and cultural fundamentals within the Iranian state that possibly cause these racist and bigoted tendencies within the Iranian political structure.
There are two possibilities with Iran. It is a it has a misunderstood leadership, and if the West would show more understanding, apologize for past actions like the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953, then perhaps Iranian behavior would change because they understand that they are being welcomed into the family of nations and they're not being rejected. First of all, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright in the year 2000 apologized for the overthrow of Mossadegh, and her apology was rejected. Second of all, unfortunately, this is not the case of a benign Iran and an aggressive West. Unfortunately, Iran, for a variety of historical reasons, has come to the conclusion that this is its era in the Middle East. You could say that after the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and the removal of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, the removal of Saddam in Iraq, one of the unanticipated byproducts was that the Iranian regime feels now it can inherit the region. I believe Iran is behaving as a hegemonial regime with regional ambitions, that while they speak about Israel a great deal, so the countries that are primarily and in the first instance in their crosshairs are the states of the Gulf. Bahrain, where the United States Fifth Fleet is located, with an 80% Shiite majority. The Saudi Eastern Province, which has a 50% Shiite population. Kuwait, with a 30% Shiite population. These are the immediate targets. But I'll link this to this discussion of this morning in the following way. If the West fails to respond to Iran's incitement to genocide, Iran will feel that it has complete freedom of action in the Straits of Hormuz. I know today that everybody is very much rightfully obsessed with what's going on with the U.S. and world economy. But if the Straits of Hormuz become an area of conflict between the Revolutionary Guards and the U.S. Navy, the price of oil will go far higher than anything you've seen until now, with the economic ramifications being horrific for the entire Western alliance. Therefore, deterring Iran now so that you can prevent conflict later is vital, not just for the security of Israel, but for the security of all of us.
I would just like to add that one of the legal issues that comes up is, what is Ahmadinejad's intended audience? Is it Iranians? Is it the Muslim world in general? I think I want to echo what Ambassador Gold just said. I think it is the larger Muslim world. I think that Iran wants to be a leader in the Middle East, and toppling Israel, eliminating its people, is a big part of that goal.
Divestment, which is a very important initiative, can only have limited success as long as companies feel that others will profit if they pull back. You know how long the divestment campaign in South Africa took? 12 years. In 12 years, I don't want to know how much enriched uranium the Iranians will possess. Nonetheless, it's very much worthwhile doing. However, unless you put Iran and its leadership, especially its leadership, in the position that the South Africans were in the 1980s, companies will trade with Iran. There's a lot of money to be made. But if trading with Iran carries with it the same negativity that trading with the apartheid regime in South Africa carried in the 1980s, if that happens, then you have a chance of getting a lot of state legislatures and a lot of friendly governments in the West to adopt the divestment strategies.
Professor L.E. Richter.
I, as a medical epidemiologist, track trends in hate language and incitement as indicators of genocide. One of the things I have noticed is that the rate of use of medical metaphors by Ahmadinejad has increased over the last 3 or 4 years. Starting at a rate of about once or twice per year, to now to a rate of about once or so per month. It represents a 6-fold increase in rate of use. So if such medical metaphors by the person of authority is an indicator of intent, boldness, or whatever, then I think this is a really warning sign.
I just want to say that Professor Richter is from the School of Public Health of Hebrew University, and he has been really pioneering this effort and looking at the language of Ahmadinejad and sharing his conclusions with all of us.
Yeah, I appreciate it too, because what you have to realize is if you go back, you can look at Nazi Germany. Those same medical metaphors were being used all the time by the Nazi regime in reference to the Jews. That they're a disease and they have to be excised from the community. I think if you look at the statements of Ahmadinejad, you see a lot of similarities. There's an effort to dehumanize Israeli Jews, which I think is part of the incitement. I make that point in my article. So I appreciate that being brought up, because I think that's part and parcel of the problem.
Yale.
Thank you so much. It's tremendously educational. My question is, what is the position of the early warning genocide advisor at the UN on this issue?
You know, unfortunately, I think it has not taken on the importance that there have been efforts made by people, I think, in this room to bring it to his attention, and unfortunately it has not become an issue that he's pursued. So that's, again, part of the problem in terms of people not taking seriously, as Ambassador Gold is talking about, what he's saying. And I think Ahmadinejad plays on that. You know, he'll make a statement here and there that, you know, tries to inject a little bit of doubt into whether or not what he's saying is real. But then he makes, for all those, he makes, 50 statements that show without any doubt what kind of intention that he has. And I think the world has been lulled into a sense of complacency. I wrote an op-ed piece that appeared in the Orange County Register earlier this year that said that genocide is a long process in the sense that you have to condition people mentally so that they're ready to take on the kind of action that Ahmadinejad would like to have happen. And you can't just, in this country, and in the world, I think, we tend to look for sound bites, and we react to sound bites, and then once the sound bite is no longer in the 24-hour news cycle, we move on. And in the meantime, we have much bigger issues that are afoot that we're ignoring. And I think Ahmadinejad is one of them. So, unfortunately, no action has been taken in that regard, as far as I know. I don't know if Ambassador Gold has any more insights on that. No.
Yes, here. And then you.
We have not come here with an agenda of action in terms of regime change or in terms of all the other possibilities that have been raised by those who follow Iran. We're here with a very limited goal, to point out what is incitement to genocide, to view it in other cases as well, whether it's Rwanda, whether it's the Holocaust. We have people here from Darfur, from Rwanda itself, who will speak in our second session. And we're not here to make a whole elaborate policy statement about what to do about Iran. And that's also an internal American decision, what the United States decides to do. We obviously have very strong voices. This morning we heard someone very senior in the Republican Party, Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. We have Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who has been a senior advisor to both Senator Hillary Clinton and Senator Barack Obama, and there's a unity that we're hearing on this. But I'll leave that for them to decide about what kind of action should be taken against Iran. All we can do is point out there is a violation of the Genocide Convention going on, and as Irwin Cutler will say later, there's a certain responsibility on the countries of the world that emanates from that violation.
Just briefly, as I point in my article, I think it makes a lot of sense to try to take legal action against Ahmadinejad. I think that is something that can make a tremendous difference on the world stage and possibly in Iran itself, because I think it would help expose what, in large part, this supposed leader is all about. So I agree that that's the focus that we have here, but legal action can be a possibility, and when you commit a crime like he has, you need to be indicted.
Yes, from the Jacob Blaustein Institute.
Well, first of all, as to the venue issue, I agree that it would be difficult to get a prosecution started in the International Criminal Court, but I think it's possible, and it would be by way of Security Council referral. I talked about that in my article, and not only is it the really only realistic way that we could probably seek prosecution of Ahmadinejad, but it would show a consensus, I think, on part of the world that this is the right thing to do. So I think it would be the best forum. There is the possibility under universal jurisdiction statutes that a country that had great courage, such as Australia or maybe even Canada, could try to prosecute Ahmadinejad pursuant to those statutes in a domestic jurisdiction. So that would be another possibility. I think with respect to the ICJ, and as I understand it, that's what Australia has been thinking about, is filing a complaint as a member of the Genocide Convention under the Compromissory Clause, Article 9. Litigation could be brought against Iran. I think that would not be a bad thing, and I would welcome it. On the other hand, I think it's important to stress the individual responsibility of Ahmadinejad, and I think that having an action against Iran in general would tend to take away from this principle of individual responsibility, which I think is a cornerstone of international criminal law as it's developed. So that's the first part of your question, and then the second part I think had to do with whether or not that there was a pushback, or if there were dissent against, or opinions that could be voiced against the person who's inciting, that would make a difference. First of all, I would have to say that it's not entirely true that there was no other voice in Rwanda. Certainly, I think the RPF was being broadcast into the country during the lead up to and during the genocide. Now, how effective that was in countering RTLM, I think we've seen it wasn't. As far as what's going on the world stage right now, I don't think that given the elements that I pointed out to you, from a legal perspective. So from a factual perspective, what happened in Rwanda, I say that I don't think that's true. But from a legal perspective, if you look at the elements, that I just don't think that you can look at that as an element. It's extraneous to the calculation. If somebody is inciting to genocide and meets the elements that I talked about, then you can prosecute. You might argue that from the perspective of whether with the context, that maybe that would show that contextually, from the external context, that you couldn't meet that element. But that would be for, I think, a trier of fact to consider. I think the evidence is there for an indictment, and that's what the world community should do.
I think we need to, unfortunately, bring it to a close for this morning's session, and have some lunch and have a break. But we will have further discussion this afternoon, as well as some very direct testimony from eyewitnesses, from a member of the Sudanese parliament who is going to tell us about the genocides in Sudan and the role of incitement in those genocides, and from Esther Mujuwayo, who is a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, who was an expert witness at the ICTR, who can also tell us about incitement there. We will see a movie screening of a film made by Frank Chalk, who is a professor at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, on the subject of hate propaganda. And then finally, to bring a close to our proceedings today, and then having questions, Professor Irwin Cutler, that amazing and dynamic member of Parliament from Canada, former Attorney General and Justice Minister. So I thank you very much for your being with us this morning, and it's now time for a break and lunch.
I'll never forget having those documents and, bringing them, being the courier, that's very...
careful.
Yep.
What do you want me to do?
That's it. You should let Sharon know. Good job. Thanks. Good job. I can just drag it. announcement?
Yes. You sit here. Ask your reaction to the speaker.
Sure.
Sit down here.
Okay.
And we're going to start. You stand up when you speak.
I'll put it off. Okay. To allow you to concentrate on your... Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Hello. Hello. Hate to break up lunch, but we have a very interesting and extended program for this afternoon. We are going to go right into the program. We will miss the movie, which is unfortunate. But before starting our program, I'd like to point out the attendance with us this morning of the Honorable Fiamma Nierenstein, the Deputy Commissioner of Foreign Affairs of the Italian Parliament. She has been with us, but is now going to will have to leave before the program gets on. But we're delighted to have had you with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. I'm here for a couple of reasons. My name is Harold Tanner. I'm the acting chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations. We are a co-sponsor of this program. I'm here for a couple of reasons. One is because Dory Gold asked me, and that's good enough. The second, which is even more important than that, is I have 8 grandsons. And I'd like my grandsons to have the same opportunities to live in peace and prosperity and comfort in a land of opportunity that I have had, and to have the opportunity, as I have had, to see the country of Israel grow from nothing and flourish into being one of the most prosperous and democratic states in the world. It is important that we point out to everyone, that each of us points out to everyone the challenge that Mr. Ahmadinejad and his cockamamie views pose for all of us, because unfortunately too many people, or too few people in the world, believe what he has to say. Our first speaker this afternoon is Esther Mugucera. Ms. Mugucera is a survivor of the Rwanda Genocide in 1994. She has been there. She has lost family. She has suffered. She has been discriminated, and she still fights back and tells the story of the Rwandan genocide. Ms. Mugucera, thank you.
for joining us. Please. I think if you don't mind, it'd be easier using this microphone here. Oh, how long do you have?
I don't know.
About 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. I want to ask the technician, perhaps, first to put a build. This photo is from 89. I was married for 1 year. We had our first baby, Anna, and we went to my husband's family, and we were celebrating. From left, the one from left is Ngabo. He was a brother of my husband. Then comes Carrera, my father-in-law, the father of my husband. Then comes the mom of my husband. In the hands, she has the baby. Then it's me. Then it's my husband. Then it's a cousin of my husband, Nyama Askwa. Then a sister of my husband, Mutesi. And a cousin, Mogarago. I just wanted to show you what is a genocide. The only people still alive now from this build is the baby and me. The baby, she's now a big girl, she's now 20. She's going to be 20. But all the rest, they have all been wiped out. This is the side of my my husband, the family-in-law. But you will have the same if I have a picture of my family. My father, my mother, and everybody, they were also wiped out. And we were not in the same places. We were all over in Rwanda. We were not living all together. But wherever was a Tutsi, it was really, really a miracle that you survived. It was general. And nobody was spared. You see, like, there are children who were born after all the children of Ngabo here. They have been all killed. They were still babies. So it was not sparing anybody. We have been living through the massacres since '59. They will come home, they will burn the house, they will they will eat the cows, and they will loot everything. And we run and we hide. After 1 month, it was called, among those famous euphemisms, it was called the bad wind. It was not pogrom, it was not killing, it was bad wind. So after the bad wind, we will come back home, we will build again, we will have cows again, we will plant again, and for the next 5 or for the next 10 years. And it will happen again, and it will happen again. But as long as they have not killed us, I remember what was very strong in the family. The parents told us, don't worry. As long as they take things, as long as they burn the house, as long as they take the cows, you can always build again. You can always have cows again. You can always plant again. Be sure that you keep what they cannot take, and be sure that you develop what they cannot take. And this is why we grow up really with a culture of develop your values, develop what makes a human being is not the things, but what you have inside in your heart and what you have inside in your head. And from there, I think the Hutu have been thinking and have been saying, have been making myth that the Tutsi are very clever. No, not only clever, they are lying a lot. They know all the ways because you have been able to make a living again. But at least in the recent years, it was not so hard, not so bad as in '94. Every time it was a degree higher. And in '94, what we have been talking today and about this hate propaganda, this time the propaganda was official. They were not hiding at all. They were using the radio. They were using the newspaper. There used to be a newspaper, this Kangura, one of the 3 men who was condemned in the Tribunal. He has a newspaper in which he will write the 10 commandments of a good Hutu. And then the 10 Commandments is you will not marry, don't marry a Tutsi woman, don't give job to Tutsi, don't make business with Tutsi, don't take them in the army. So all the rest, they were there. They were written. Everybody was seeing it. And on the radio, of course, they were singing. One of the most terrible songs they were singing was Yetu Atsemba Tsembe, Yetu Atsemba Tsembe. I remember that because it was like a hit. It was so well done. The music was so well done. And it was passing every 5 minutes. So even for us who were to exterminate, and it means let us exterminate them, let us exterminate them. But it was coming all the time in your ear. So even us to be exterminated, we were singing, let us exterminate them. Because it was impossible not to hear that. And this was obvious. This was before the genocide. I'm talking of that because for me, when we have conferences like that, I'm very bitter. Because for the genocide of the Tutsi in Rwanda, at least it was possible to prevent that. All the elements were there. It was known before it happened. We even thought, some people thought to go away, and they did. Some people flee in Burundi or in Nairobi, in Kenya. But our misfortune was, I'm very bitter with the UN. The UN came. There was peace agreement. There were blue berets. So we thought we are safe because they are there to protect us. So in Rwanda, it was not a matter of deciding if they send troops, if they do what. The fact was the troops were there, but they needed a mandate to protect us. They never got that mandate. Rather, they took people out, the blue berets, les casques bleus who were there. When 10 of the Belgians were killed, they took them out. And when they took them out, it was the signal for the killers. You have free space. There is one place in Rwanda which is really, we call it the shame of the UN. There were people, when the genocide started, people ran in all places where the UN were. So many people gathered in that school, Don Bosco, in Kichukiro. On 11th of April, the Belgians decided to go out. But all around the school, there were killers. The militia were all around. So you see the UN going out and the killers coming in and killing everybody. Now I'm a bit skeptic about if we ever learn lessons. We have been talking today of I can't pronounce his name. I'm not doing it extra. Yeah, the Iranian president being now in the UN speaking. In 1994, when the genocide was happening in Rwanda, the government of Rwanda, who was perpetrating the genocide, was sitting in the UN. And nobody speaking in the Security Council. This happened. And after that, they saw that 1 million people died. And now, he's there, he's speaking. They are allowing him to speak. So you will understand that I'm not really, I don't give so much credit. I don't think that it is going to come from there. We have perhaps to learn other strategies. At least for Rwanda, it has never worked. So, thank you. Then we can ask ourselves the question, if it was known for Rwanda, if it was obvious, if it was preventable, why it was not done? And this is where I think we have really to be pragmatic. Who has interest in that? Where is the will? Where is the political will? And where are the forces? Who are going to taper sur la table? Who are going to say enough is enough? In the case of Rwanda, the only thing which should have done it is that we were human, just human beings. And there was a convention, the Convention of Geneva. But again, allow me to be cynical. I don't believe in human being is not human being. It should be. A human being should be a human being. But I don't believe it anymore. When they came to evacuate, at the beginning of the genocide, when they came to evacuate the French, the Belgian, the American, and so on, they evacuated all of them with cats and dogs. And we asked them, I remember my kids have passports, and I asked the French or the Belgian, I don't remember who were evacuating, to take my kids with. A friend was waiting for them in Belgium. They told me no. She's a Tutsi kid. They couldn't evacuate her. So for me, I really say a Belgian cat, a French dog, has more value than my baby. It should not be. And I really want, I think when I have the chance to be in conferences like that, I really want to challenge you, because you have the chance to be living in countries where democracy is really democracy, if it is. But let me keep my belief that you can influence your decision makers because you are voting for them. So can you be the people, can you be the citizen who are making things change, who are making your decision makers agree that a human being is a human being, not regarding of if I'm black, if I'm Tutsi, if I don't have any petrol, if I don't have any gold in my country. So I'm cynical, but I still have hope, because I still I believe if you come here, if you have been attending, that you are somewhere, you are engaged, somewhere you want to engage. And as you have been saying, you have grandchildren. I'm doing that because I have children also, and I want them to have a better place on earth to live. I wanted the last point I wanted to bring, and perhaps to challenge you again. We talk of prevention of genocide, then we didn't prevent, then the genocide happened, we didn't stop it. But I want to say, fortunately, even all the plans they are making of wiping out Israel, they have planned that there won't be any Tutsi left in Rwanda. This was the final solution, as Hitler planned it for the Jews in the Nazi site. But fortunately, I think there is not a complete genocide. There is always survivors. Dieu merci. And then, this is my point, my last point. I survived. I have the chance to survive really miraculously. I don't have a single wound on my head, which is many of my friends who survived, they survived under the bodies. The perpetrators left them for dead. Many of the women who survived who are in Rwanda, actually we have done a very strong and big organization of widows, because we are trying to say, men, they wanted us to be dead, they didn't get us, and they will not get us. Let us be strong, let us stand up and not be on the ground as they wanted. Let us be, we don't want to show them that we are miserable. So even if we are miserable, but we try to smile, we try to be okay, and to go, continue to avancer, to go forward. But where I'm calling the international community, if you were not there in '94, where are you now? Where are you now for the women who survived? Those women survived because they have been raped every day through 3 months. Most of them, more than the half, are infected with AIDS. They started to die. In the beginning, they were dying because we didn't have the medication to treat them. Meanwhile, and you will understand why I don't really trust the UN, while the women were dying in the prison, in the UN Tribunal in Arusha, the men who were HIV positive, who have raped women, who have infected them, they were getting the treatment, the 3 combined therapy, the antiretroviral, so that they can be alive, so that they can be judged. When we ask them, the women who are coming to testify, the women who have been raped, are testifying. You need the witness to make fair trials. So you have to keep them alive. We were not asking for charity. For us, it was justice. We have been told no. It was not, the court has not been created like that. There was no provision for the victims. We've never got a single medication from the UN. So you can testify that you go back and you die. And the man is going to be okay and he will be judged. So I really want to say, If you want to continue to learn from our lesson, I'm very cynical again. Okay, we are giving our body to the science. You can learn about it. You can make theses. You can see how to prevent and whatever. But I challenge you, help us to be alive and to tell you. Help the women who are dying of AIDS. Help the children who survived without anybody in the family and who have been parents with the age of 6. Okay, I want to stop here. I want to thank you for having invited me. I really think wherever I can say that, I will say it. It is possible to prevent now. It is possible to stop all those people preaching hate, because I think they are not the majority. They are very loud, but they are not the strongest one. But if you let them and let them speaking so loud, one thinks they are so powerful. So let us unite, and I think it is not a vain word to stop them in time. Thank you.
We have just heard a definition of guts. Thank you very much, Esther. I think the applause that you received from the audience says it all. We hope you will keep on talking and keep on fighting. And good luck to the women of Rwanda. Thank you. Our next speaker is a Sudanese lawyer, member of parliament, Saliq Mahmoud Osman. He's won the EU Human Rights Award. He works with victims of human rights abuses in the troubled region. It says somewhere here that he provides free legal services to victims of human rights abuses in his country. And he's been doing this for more than 2 decades. It's my pleasure to present Saliq Mahmoud Osman.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, the organizers, Dr. Doric Gold, and Professor Gregory Stanton. Thank you very much. We met so many times, but I especially thank very much also the Honorable Irwin Cutler, who took the trouble to call me, asking me, and insisting that I come here. I come from Darfur, and I'm a practitioner lawyer. I have been working in Darfur for a long time now. It was even earlier, before the eruption of this current situation, that through my work, I came across cases where basic human rights were always violated. Then, when this current situation erupted 5 years ago now, violations of basic human rights and international humanitarian law increased. Today, the huge suffering of the people of Darfur is described and defined as one of the worst human suffering ever on earth today. And this is true, because according to the UN agencies and other NGOs, human rights organizations monitoring the situation there, it is true today that more than 4 million people, Darfuris of specific ethnicities, mainly the four Masalid, Zagawa, Midop, and Berti, have been forcibly displaced. Today, more than 3 million of these forced displaced people are living in the camps for more than 5 years now, and they are not able to go back to their homes because there is no security, and because the land that has been depopulated is taken by the Arab Janjaweed militias coming from outside even from our country, from Chad, Mali, Niger, and even Mauritania. More than 500,000 people have been killed through aerial bombardment and ground attacks by government soldiers and Janjaweed Arab militias. Extrajudicial killings happen and still happening up to this moment. Women and girls of every age have been targeted and sexually abused. We documented in our center cases of young girls as young as 4 years old that have been sexually targeted. More than 2,000 villages have been destroyed. And now, despite these horrible crimes, none of the perpetrators have been brought to justice. All of the perpetrators are still beyond the reach of our domestic justice. And now even the 2 suspects who have been identified by the International Criminal Court prosecutor are still beyond the reach of justice. And the government of Sudan is persistently refusing to hand them over in defiance to the international community's political will. We have more than a dozen of UN Security Council resolutions, all of them adopted under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. But unfortunately, none of them is being sufficiently implemented. Today, the plight of the survivors in the camps even is more greater. You might have heard about the Kalma camp attacks on the 25th of last August, when more than 50 people were killed when they were inside the camp, considering that they were in a safer place because the attack was under the watch of the UNAMID forces, that is the UN African Union forces. They were not able to protect and save lives. The question you might have in your mind is, why is this happening in Darfur after Rwanda? It is simply because there is incitement, government incitement, because there is hatred. It is racial. You go to the camps, all the population of the camps are from the African ethnicities. None of them is from other ethnicities, the oppressors, the Arab militias. This started when this current government took power through a military coup in 1989. And it started to maintain that Sudan is an Arab Islamic country, denying us our identity and trying to impose on us identity which is not ours. Yes, people of Darfur are Muslims, but they are not fanatics. This is the difference. When people said, yes, in Darfur we have been long time marginalized, this time will not accept the imposing of new identity on us. And this is why young people from the villages and communities started to challenge the government. This is when the rebel groups started to organize themselves. And then the retaliation from the side of the government was amazingly huge. It started to use anti-NOF aircraft and helicopter gunships from China and Russia, killing our people. Now, situation is just simple like this. For me, it has been genocide, and it is genocide for a long time. Here in the United States of America, it has been identified and defined by the administration as genocide long time ago now. And then, always victims in the camps listen to tough words from outside, from Europe, from America, from Canada. And we are confused because we don't see acts. It's a long time since people said, never again to Holocaust, never again to Rwanda, or not on our watch. But it's again Rwanda today. It's Holocaust. And it's happening on our watch. And we have just feeling comfortable because you people sent money to keep us alive. This is good, but it's not sufficient. We want protection. We want to go back home. We cannot live there forever, for indefinite. It's not good. If you keep us there, you are establishing ethnic cleansing. You have to ask your consciousness, is it acceptable now that after 5 years, people live there and there are a lot of UN Security Council resolutions about the deployment of forces. The purpose is only to protect lives and to allow us to go back. And nobody is sending a single helicopter to stop the aerial bombardment from the government helicopter gunships. The situation for the people of Darfur is that the only hope we have today is that the brave man, Luis Moreno Ocampo, took a step forward to identify 2 suspects and again to apply for the arrest warrant of those who are still clinging on power, killing people and designing plans. And yet, the rest of the world, some people around the world are telling us, no, don't talk about justice. If you talk about justice, you will jeopardize peace process or the deployment of the hybrid forces, which is not true. We don't have any peace process. There's no peace to talk about jeopardizing. There's no deployment. So why? It is only justice that can make the difference today. Please allow us to try this mechanism of justice and accountability to put end to the culture and atmosphere of impunity. We have a judiciary that is not willing and not capable to provide justice. This is why it is the International Criminal Tribunal only that has the proper jurisdiction to bring to justice even only handful of notorious perpetrators who are still enjoying power in Khartoum. This is the only thing. Some people made prediction that the application will create chaos. On the contrary, it's not. It didn't create chaos. It is made things start moving today. There is a lot of talk about peace talks, allowing the deployment, and now they are working on the back scene here in the UN in New York to ask for the deferral under Article 16. We should not allow that deferral. If we allow that deferral, it means that we are insulting the work of the International Criminal Court. We are exposing victims and survivors in Darfur for more suffering. Let's not allow that application of the Article 16. The last comment is that if Rwanda, sometimes some people would argue that it happened and occurred swiftly, that the international community didn't have sufficient time to intervene to save lives, as my sister said, but it was not true also. But today, we have a situation in Darfur where perpetrators of genocide are threatening that if they are held accountable for it or asked for their acts, they are even going to cause more bloodshed and to kill more people. And they are preparing themselves for that. And we are watching them. Now tell me, if we have a genocide that is coming up, and we are talking about prevention of genocide, is it true that divestment, for example, can help us to stop that? Because divestment, in case of Sudan, would not work. They have Iran with them. They have China. They have even South Africa. It is good now. Thabo Mbeki is down. He is the one who has been supporting this government of Sudan. He was sending even weaponry that was used during the apartheid against the South Africans. He has been sending it, tear gas, to this government. Freedom fighters, you can see now how they change sometimes. Now, divestment might be a long-term measure, but it won't work for us. We want immediate, decisive acts to prevent that genocide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've heard two very powerful examples of how the world body has failed its member states, its member people. For various reasons, we have failed and we are continuing to fail. The United Nations in Geneva, the so-called Human Rights Organization, has been unable to get satisfactory resolutions on the subject of Darfur because of the negative votes of certain member states. Our last speaker of the day is someone I can introduce without any notes. I've introduced him many times. It has always been a privilege, as it is now. I happened to have been in a wedding in Toronto on Saturday night, and I sat next to a woman who was a senior jurist in the country of Canada, and trying to play a little geography, I said I knew Irwin Cutler, and you would think I knew God or some other deity, and the adjectives were brilliant, caring, soft-spoken, doesn't take himself as seriously as his intellect would allow him, or as other people who have accomplished as much as he has might take themselves. Irwin Cutler is one of Canada's premier lawyers. He's one of the world's most important human rights lawyers. He's former Minister of Justice of the country of Canada. It is my pleasure to introduce a man I'd like to call friend, Irwin Cutler.
Thank you, Harold. I'm sorry that you have to be burdened once again in introducing me, but I always appreciate having you introduce me because it comes from a friend and colleague. I want to begin by saying that, we are in the presence of two great heroes today, in Esther and Salah. And I have to say, not only survivors, not only expert witnesses, but really, as you can see, courageous advocates of the collective responsibility to prevent, not only by governments, but by citizenry. And I will say that if I had come here today and only had the opportunity to hear them and not to speak myself on this panel, I would have said that that would have been cause enough to be here. It was just wonderful, really, to hear. And what you have taught us, really, is that the enduring lesson of the Holocaust and the genocide that followed, and particularly in Rwanda, and the genocide by attrition in Darfur that is going on as we meet, is that these genocides occurred not only because of the machinery of death, but because of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, coupled with, and this is the lesson that they made compellingly before us as witnesses, coupled with the indifference and inaction by the international community, including the United Nations, in the face of that genocide. The ultimate horror of these genocides, not only that they occurred, the ultimate horror is that these genocides were preventable. Now, with respect to the genocides in the Holocaust, Rwanda, and Darfur, whose aftershocks still continue amongst the survivors, and where in Darfur, as in the women with AIDS in Rwanda, and whereas in Darfur the killing fields continue. As we meet, some 4 million Darfuri are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance after over 500,000 have already been killed and 3 million internally displaced and the like, and all that is associated with it. With respect to these genocides, we were not able, and that is, as I say, the ultimate horror, to prevent them. There is one case now where the responsibility to prevent, if it is acted upon, can prevent that which is unfolding from becoming a genocidal killing field. For we are witnessing today, and indeed we have been witnessing for some time, a state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, whose epicenter is Ahmadinejad's Iran. I say Ahmadinejad's Iran because I want to distinguish this from the people and publics of Iran, who are otherwise themselves the targets of Ahmadinejad's massive repression. And what we are seeing today in Ahmadinejad's Iran is the toxic convergence of the advocacy of the most horrific of crimes, namely genocide, the crime whose name we should even shudder to mention, embedded in the most virulent of hatreds, namely anti-Semitism, dramatized by the parading, and you saw this in Dori Gold's presentation, by the parading in the streets of Tehran, even before Ahmadinejad became president, of a Shiab 3 missile draped in the emblem, "Wipe Israel off the map." And sometimes with the other words, as the Imam says, namely that this is a religiously State-Sanctioned Incitement to Genocide, while President Ahmadinejad and others exhort the gathered crowds with cries of death to Israel and death to America. In fact, if one looks at Ahmadinejad's Iran today, what one finds, and reference was made to this, is the resort to what might be called incendiary and inflammatory epidemiological metaphors, the kind of biological language reminiscent of Hitler's Nazism. I don't like to make analogies to anything that relates to the Holocaust because that was a unique horror in and of itself. But the use of these epidemiological metaphors is very reminiscent and reflective of those same biological metaphors in Nazism. For example, Ahmadinejad characterizes Israel as filthy bacteria, or a stinking corpse, or a cancerous tumor that needs to be excised, or a germ of corruption, while referring to Jews as evil incarnate, defilers of Islam, bloodthirsty barbarians, enemies of humanity. The whole as prologue to and justification for a Middle East genocide, while at the same time denying the Nazi one. And as Gregory Stanton put it, yet another indicator of genocide, the denial of the past genocide. Indeed, the calls by the most senior figures in the Iranian government that call for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews through their terrorist proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas, whom I might add, are genocidal in their objective, anti-Semitic in their ideology, terrorist in their instrumentality, and global in their reach. These calls are frighteningly reminiscent of the calls by the Rwandan leadership at the time for the extermination of Tutsis by the Hutu leadership. The crucial difference is that the Hutus were equipped with machetes, while Iran, in defiance of the world community, has already succeeded in developing a long-range missile delivery system while it seeks to acquire the nuclear arms to fit that long-range military system, all for the purpose which former President Hashemi Rafsanjani said, quote, could eliminate Israel in one single storm. Now, as we meet, President Ahmadinejad has addressed the General Assembly, making a mockery of history, of law, indeed of the UN itself. Think about it. A man who incites to genocide, a man who has defied UN Security Council resolutions regarding his pursuit of atomic weaponry, a man who engages in these epidemiological and dehumanizing metaphors with regard to Israel and Jews, a man who warns other Muslims that if they recognize Israel they will burn in the Ummah of Islam, a man who is complicit in crimes against humanity, the worst crimes against humanity, through his terrorist proxies, etc. Such a man belongs not at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly, but belongs as the object of a criminal indictment. The failure to stop the past genocides, in the unspeakable, and unspeakable because it was preventable, genocide of Rwanda, caused the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to lament in 2004 on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide as follows, and I quote, "We must never forget our collective failure to protect at least 800,000 defenseless men, women and children who perished in Rwanda 10 years ago. Such crimes," he said, "cannot be reversed. Such failures cannot be repaired. The dead cannot be brought back to life." As Esther knows tragically only too well. So, what can we do, he asked. The answer is for the international community, in the case now of Ahmadinejad's Iran, to pay heed to the precursors of genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran and to fulfill its responsibilities under international law. For what is so often ignored, and I have found in discussing this with government leaders who are signatories to the Genocide Convention, is not even known, is that state parties to the Genocide Convention, like the United States or Canada or countries in the European Union, have not only a right, but a responsibility to act so as to prevent the genocide and to punish the direct and public incitement to genocide. Indeed, as I was mentioning before to Gregory Gordon, as one who was involved in the prosecution of incitement with regard to Rwandans, as in the Mugucera case that he presented earlier, at which time I was Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, I can tell you that the aggregate of precursors to genocide in the Ahmadinejad's Iran is actually more intensified and greater in number than that which occurred in the horrific genocide in Rwanda, where we did not exercise that responsibility to prevent. And so, together with the support of a renowned group of jurists and experts and survivors, which include Esther and Sally amongst them, which include Gregory Gordon and Greg Stanton, who are here today, we are releasing today, and you have copies that we brought here, a petition that is titled, in effect, "The Danger of a Genocidal and Nuclear Iran. The Responsibility to Prevent." A responsibility to prevent petition which documents, I believe in unprecedented fashion, with the work of the evidence that was otherwise compiled by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, documents the critical mass of evidence regarding Iran's state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. And it calls, among others, upon state parties to the Convention, upon the United Nations and the various competent bodies to act so as to hold Iran to account. In fact, Esther asked the question and Sally asked the question, why did, in effect, Rwanda occur? You had, at the time, the UN Security Council sitting in 1994 while the killing fields unfolded. And you have Darfur with the precedent of Rwanda. And so this petition seeks to do two things. First, to set forth the precursors to genocide, which are in effect both condition and indicators of the genocide to follow, and the legal recourses and remedies which can be acted upon to prevent it. Let there be no mistake about it. Iran has already started down the road to genocide. The road to genocide has already been paved with these precursors. The crime of incitement to genocide has already been committed. As Gregory Gordon said, one does not have to wait until the actual killing fields occur. The crime occurs when the state-sanctioned incitement is acting itself out as it is in Iran. And I'm going to just summarize. You can look at the paper, full paper today, of those precursors, those predictors and conditions for genocide in Ahmadinejad's Iran, which underpin the critical mass of evidence as to why one can state that Iran has paved the way to genocide and that the genocide in that sense has already begun through the crime of incitement. Number one, delegitimization. The first step, and here Gregory Stanton has pointed this out, the first step is to classify the other, the targeted state and its people, as illegitimate and unworthy of the universe of obligation of which Helen Fine spoke about. Let me just quote one statement from this phenomenon of delegitimization that comes from the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and I quote, "What are you? A forged government and a false nation.
They gathered wicked people from all over the world and made them something called the Israeli nation. Is that a nation? All the malevolent and evil Jews have gathered there. Those Jews who went to Israel were malevolent, evil, greedy, thieves, and murderers. We're not talking about the Zionist regime, that euphemism, which itself is part of the use of euphemistic language. We are talking about the bold language of delegitimation, which takes us right into dehumanization. In other words, the next genocidal precursor is the dehumanization of Israelis and Jews through those biological metaphors of which I spoke. And the paper gives a list you can almost analogize with regard to Nazi use of metaphors and the use of metaphors of the Iranian regime, and you will see both in comparable context. The third is that of demonization. In other words, from moving from delegitimization to dehumanization, one goes to demonization. Under this paradigm, the would-be victims of genocide are portrayed as if they were inspirations of the devil. In that sense, dehumanization coupled with demonization accomplishes the dual, macabre purpose of making the would-be victim appear not only to be less human, but also to appear more threatening in a way that both together make it a warrant for genocide. The fourth precursor, of which I've already spoken and others have, is Holocaust denial. The fifth, of which Gregory Gordon has spoken of in his paper and in his talk, is the false accusation in the Mirror, yet another warrant for genocide. And you find here how genocidaires, as they did in Rwanda and as they are doing in Darfur, use this strategy to convince the receiver audience that if the diabolical and murderous other, quote-unquote, is not attacked, then they will fall victim to the other, thus casting their own genocidal action as if it were self-defense. What more macabre kind of incitement can you have? Which brings to the sixth one, and that is satanic Jews as enemies of humanity. Here too, replete in the brief are the references to the manner in which Jews are referred to as being enemies of humanity, enemies of Islam, people who, as he speaks of them as having, quote, no boundaries, limits, or taboos when it comes to killing human beings, that they are fighting a war against humanity. And then, again, to quote one of the Ayatollahs, one should fight the Jews and vanquish them so that the conditions for the advent of the hidden imam be met. Again, the religious incitement. And finally, the whole phenomenon of anti-Semitism as prologue and justification for genocide, again reminiscent of the worst uses of this most virulent of hatred. Now, what has happened is that Iran has channeled all these 7 precursors to genocide into the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. In other words, this culture of hate is such that Iran does not even feel any need to somehow leave its genocidal intention as being unspoken or unclear or ambiguous or euphemistic. On the contrary, the calls for Israel's destruction by Iranian officials are explicit and without ambiguity. And again, they're set forth in our brief, and I won't go through them here, but when you read them, I have to tell you that when we compiled them, there was a certain chilling sense, not only that we had been there before, but we had been there before and done nothing about it. And we are there again and still not doing anything about it. And that's why the petition goes into the second part, which is to identify the legal recourses, to identify the remedies which state parties to the Genocide Convention have not only a right, but an obligation to invoke. This is not just a matter of a kind of, however important it is, moral exhortation about the responsibility to prevent. It is a clear-cut legal obligation on all the state parties to the Genocide Convention. It's not a matter simply of speaking about the horror of state-sanctioned incitement to genocide. There is a clear and compelling obligation to prevent it, as set forth and as Gregory Gordon gave us in his talk today in the Genocide Convention and the like. And our petition deals with the panoply of remedies. I won't take you through them other than to say that it is shocking that as we meet the most modest of remedies, simply referring Ahmadinejad's genocidal incitement to the UN Security Council to be held to account, even that has not yet been done by one state party. Even a modest remedy such as the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon exercising his responsibility under Article 99 of the UN Charter to refer a matter of international peace and security to the United Nations Security Council or other organs of the UN. Not only has that not yet been done, but no state has yet called upon Ban Ki-moon to even do it. No state has initiated an interstate complaint against Iran, which is also a state party to the Genocide Convention, before the International Court of Justice. The UN Security Council has not even yet begun to discuss as to whether Ahmadinejad should be held personally and criminally liable so that we can strike a blow against the culture of impunity. Countries like Canada, which do have a universal jurisdiction framework, I know I was part of the law that enacted the war crimes and crimes against humanity, have not even opened a file with respect to Ahmadinejad should he decide to come to Canada as he went to Italy. I can go on, but what you can see is that there are a panoply of remedies, yet not one, as we meet, has yet been invoked by any state party to the Genocide Convention. Now, I know you might say, and with this I will close, because my wife says to me what Esther said in her talk today. You know, don't you ever get to the point where you should not only be skeptical but cynical that this UN will ever act? Or even that the state parties will ever act? Fine, you have this petition. Fine, you're calling upon people to act. But aren't you cynical as to whether they will really act at all? Look at the past horrors, and that should tell you the story. And I say, if we look at the past horrors, the unspeakable horror, not only the genocide, but that these genocides were preventable, and we have a chance now to prevent a genocide, then if the state parties do not act, and if the United Nations does not act, then they will, in effect, sound a fatal blow against the whole corpus of international law, United Nations, international instruments, and the like, including what we have referred to as the Never Again Convention, namely the Genocide Convention. We are approaching the 60th anniversary of that convention. Now is the time for the state parties to act. And I will say this, that if our petition serves no other purpose, through the exposing the critical mass of evidence in Ahmadinejad's state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, and through the identification of the remedies to be taken, if it serves no other purpose, then at least making the world aware that we do have a genocidal process on the way, that we do have and can prevent it. At least we will be saying at this point, number one, we will be showing solidarity with the victims, not only prospective victims of the Iranian, but our remembrance of victims in Rwanda and Darfur. We will, at the same time, as Iranians themselves tell me, we will be emboldening the victims in Iran itself, that to tell them they are not alone with respect to Ahmadinejad's regime. We will be emboldening progressive forces in Iran that, yes, maybe there are those who are speaking out and alerting the international community, not only with regard to the impending genocide, but also with regard to the kind of massive repression and danger of a nuclear as well as genocidal Iran and a rights-oppressing Iran. We may be able to delegitimate Ahmadinejad not only internationally but domestically. That too can embolden civil society in Iran. By exposing the critical mass of evidence of the state-sanctioned incitement to genocide, the precursors to genocide, that which acts as both prologue and justification for genocide. Perhaps this can act as a wake-up call to the state parties in the international community, the United Nations and the like, to exercise their responsibility to prevent. And so I close by saying that the time has come not only to think but to act in terms of prevention rather than intervention after the fact, after the genocide occurs, after it's too late. In terms of accountability, not a culture of impunity which encourages the perpetrators to continue with their incitement. In terms of action, and not in terms of indifference or inaction, which also serves to encourage the perpetrators. If we fail to act so as to prevent a genocidal nuclear Iran, we will embolden not only Iran, but others as well, and we will embolden perpetrators everywhere to believe that they can get away with it. That they got away with it in Rwanda, they're getting away with it in Darfur, they can get away with it in Iran and beyond. And this constitutes a threat not only to Israel and the Jewish people, not only to the Middle East of a destabilizing Ahmadinejad's Iran, but to international peace and security. Thank you.
What a powerful call to action. I see two questions out there. Lady here, lady there, and then the two men, and that'll probably be about all we'll have time for. Yes.
Started the process in such a complaint to the General Security Council?
Well, I think that in the case of Israel, and I've spoken with Israeli leaders, you know, it used to be said, although that's no longer true, that we don't know which will be the first Arab country to make peace. Lebanon will be the next. But on this, if I may just borrow from that analogy, I think Israel's position is they don't want to be the first to be the state party to invoke the Genocide Convention, lest it become characterized as a Jewish or Israeli issues. And given that most of the members of the international community are state parties to the Genocide Convention, it's understandable that they would hope that someone other than Israel would come forward, but it may have to come to that, that Israel will have to be a country that does come forward in order to sound the alarm, in order to serve as the international juridical wake-up call. As to the United States, as I mentioned, you know, I have been surprised how people who always talk about the Never Again Convention don't realize that that Never Again Convention contained a legal responsibility to prevent. You know, we talk about the hallowed responsibility to protect principle, which the United Nations Security Council affirmed 2.5 years ago in the aftermath of the Darfurian genocide. But we didn't realize, and leaders don't, I know this, I have spoken with somebody, they didn't even realize that the Genocide Convention has a responsibility to prevent the genocide, not just to punish it. They didn't realize that the Genocide Convention prohibits in Article 3 the direct and public incitement to genocide. That the International Criminal Court Treaty, as well as the International Criminal Tribunals for former Rwanda, Yugoslavia, have similar prohibitions with regard to incitement. That this has become part of what might be called jus cogens, overriding international law, of such a compelling nature that state parties have an obligation to act. So we're going to send this petition to every government leader and to every parliament if for no other reason than sensibilisation, as the French would put it, to sensitize them as to their obligations. And then we hope that the respective parliaments and publics in every country will call upon their leadership to act. I had something in my paper about Obama and McCain that I left out, but both of them have spoken about the danger of a genocidal nuclear Iran. Yet none of them have spoken about the responsibility to prevent. So I'm hoping that the American Senate, when the new session begins, will take it up, and that people will call upon whoever is elected president to act, if not before.
There's a woman back there. I can't see that. Yes.
My name is Joanne Prof, and I'm with the Jacob Blaustein Institute. I'm particularly interested in hearing, I don't know if this is necessarily applicable to the case of Ahmadinejad, but the Genocide Convention is actually very notably silent on the specific obligations of state parties on what exactly prevention of genocide entails. It lays out very clearly what punishment is, and I'm interested in hearing your views on where that legal basis is, because it isn't really outlined in the convention itself. And then I just have a second quick procedural question on the ICC. Can the Security Council invoke Article 16 before the accusations chamber has actually come forward with an official indictment? And if not, is it the general consensus that the tribunal or the accusations chamber might just delay the process of coming to a decision?
Well, I think, and if I'm not mistaken, I think that Gregory made reference to this. You know, the shorthand of the Genocide Convention, its official reference is, you know, the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention, on the prevention and punishment of genocide. The very title of the convention includes in it what the nature of that convention is all about, and the obligation to prevent as well as the obligation to punish. And when it prohibits direct and public incitement to genocide in Article 3, and that too is framed by what the parties are obliged to do, whether it be in Section 4 or in Section 8, or the removal of immunity from state leaders. The entire corpus of the Genocide Convention is one organized around the principle to prevent. And I know I have heard, some political leaders who have not appreciated this, and sometimes you have to just show them the Genocide Convention and read the language, and they say, oh yeah, I didn't realize that it prohibits direct and public incitement to genocide. I didn't realize that in Article 8 it says they can apply to the UN Security Council so as to, in fact, enforce Article 3. I didn't realize even that the title of the convention was one on the, etc. And we make reference to this in our petition. And Gregory, I think, spoke to this in his presentation this morning.
I'm going to exercise the right of the chair. We're in the citadel of the democracy of the world, so we're going to be a little democratic with the people who raise their hands, who want to ask questions, who already haven't had the opportunity to do so, and they will get first choice. And if we can get back to somebody for a second question, we will. Yes, sir. Then you.
I'm Leon Mugucera, former member of the U.S. Diplomatic Service. Our speakers this morning mentioned legal instruments such as the convention you just mentioned and the ICC, of course. Mr. Cutler, you mentioned a few times the phrase responsibility to protect. And of course, we're all aware of the United Nations General Assembly resolution a few years ago, which explicitly gave a little bit of strength to the responsibility to protect. And in fact, that was endorsed even in a rather lukewarm way by the Security Council. Do you think there is any potential for this so-called R2P doctrine to lend further support, action to increase the power of the Genocide Convention or the ICC?
That's a good question. I just say we initially called our document the Responsibility to Prevent petition, the R2P petition. Then we realized that might get confused with what ironically has become much better known, namely the Responsibility to Protect, whereas it is the Responsibility to Prevent that was the first manifestation of that legal obligation in the Genocide Convention. But the responsibility to protect, as Garth Evans and others who have written about it, etc., point out that the responsibility to prevent is the first component of the more generic responsibility to protect, which has responsibility to prevent, to protect, to prosecute, to build, and the like. So there's a convergence, if you will, of responsibility to prevent and responsibility to protect.
Question here.
Hi, Jean Friedberg from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And thank you very much. I don't know if any of you know Jean Friedberg from the Holocaust Museum. I don't know if any of you saw an ad in the New York Times today, but it's a big no. And it's basically a big no to President Ahmadinejad having the stage that he has. And mostly it is a no about the need for the international community to push back and to say no to all of the things that you really articulated so incredibly powerfully. The question I have is, and it comes back to responsibility, and it's a strategic question. Clearly there are these international frameworks, and there's a lot of effort going into finding ways to use the legal frameworks to push back on not only Iran and Ahmadinejad, but on all potential genocidal activities. At the Holocaust Museum, we're a bit onto this notion of individual responsibility, that everybody themselves, by standing up and by not being a bystander, because of course if there was one lesson from the Holocaust, it is about being bystanders, is that everybody themselves can have a responsibility. So it's a question actually for all of you about how, as we go out and try to find ways to push back and say no, what is that relationship between using the international frameworks and getting citizens engaged at an individual level on their own responsibility?
Anybody want to take a crack at that? If all three of you do, I'm not sure that some of us will make our airplanes.
Well, I'll just say that it's in connection to Darfur that I think is the best example here. I mean, I think with regard to Ahmadinejad, of course, you need a Security Council reference to the International Criminal Court. It's important to establish that principle, of course, of international, of individual criminal liability. It's both in the Genocide Convention and the ICC Treaty. But let's not forget that with regard to Darfur, where it was thought impossible, in fact, the special prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, as Sally mentioned, has in fact issued arrest warrants for President al-Bashir of Sudan, has issued an arrest warrant for the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, Ahmed Haroun. What is shocking here is that in a case, for example, of the Minister of Humanitarian Affairs, not only was he not surrendered to the International Criminal Court, but Sudan, in fact, promoted him to be the person responsible for hearing human rights complaints against the very atrocities that he perpetrated himself. So the question is, we need to hold both the country accountable, like Sudan, by way of a whole network of sanctions and the like, for the manner in which they are repudiating their responsibilities, qua the International Criminal Court, as well as the Genocide Convention, and we need to continue to try to hold the individuals responsible. It's both country responsibility and individual criminal responsibility.
I'm going to ask those.
Excuse me, I just wanted to
Go
say
ahead.
also about individuals, but really individuals, you and me. We tried to look in Rwanda who has resisted, because fortunately there are people who resisted and who didn't participate in the genocide, and even who took the courage to hide people, although it was very dangerous. So to see how do you develop in your children or in your school, in your student, those values of not going with the mass. Because this is the other big problem. When the mass is going and you are afraid of resisting, of being out of the big mass, so how can we develop more that in the schools, in the family, in the churches, in the civil society? Because this works a lot. And you can see resistance. You have seen resistance in all cases, and I believe in that.
There are three people in here. I'm going to, just a second, sir.
Yeah, just very few words. I will mention a situation of Darfur as how can individuals make the difference also. It's not always government. Because today we see that the humanitarian relief that comes from America and Canada and Europe. The only means that kept alive more than 5 million people on the ground there. We don't have NGOs, that is humanitarian organizations from the Arab world or the Islamic countries or from China. It's only you. And then we have seen also events of solidarity with the people of Darfur. I've been here to the United States so many times, and I participated in so many events here. You people show us great support. You send money. In the universities, I've seen rallies, and you are pressuring the administration that it's not correct to keep silent about what's happening there. And it's you who put the pressure on the government of Sudan today. I think it's both individual and state's responsibility. But I think it is you, individuals, who can make the difference in this context. So I very much, on behalf of the victims and survivors in Darfur, I thank you very much on their behalf, that you make them that to feel that they are not alone, that there are people who care about them.
There are 3 people in here. I'm going to take your questions. I'm going to take all 3 questions at once, let our panel deal with them, because we're going to have to bring this to a close. You've had your hand up for a long time, sir. Go for it.
Mr. Chairman, with respect to what's been said, I'm very grateful. Although I thought I knew a good deal about this issue when I came in, I've been educated, informed, inspired, and motivated to do more. So I thank one and all. And lastly, apropos Mr. Cutler's plea for action and mention of the 2 senators who are running for president, and the fact that the new Senate is coming in, a new Congress is coming in, there is still time in this Congress, and I just want to, with no particular reference to the sponsors of this organization, as Dory Golan has said, this is not forming an action plan and this is not a political lobby, but we have a free kit that I will give to anyone outside afterwards. If you want to go to your senators this afternoon with us or at any time before the Senate goes out with a draft letter to implore the Senate to act as the House has acted a year ago, June, I just put forth that offer.
Thank you very much. We'll let woman back there and then woman right here, and that will wind up our questions.
Joyce Sachs, Christians Israel Public Action Campaign and the ZOA. I'm going to address my comment to this young lady from the Holocaust Memorial Museum. You were talking about pushing back. Should there not be an exhibit or exhibits that say "and today" that would include testimonies from, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Ms. Mugucera and from Mr. Osman, and also featuring Ahmadinejad. There are hundreds of people that come through that museum. Let's do something and put it into a museum where people can see it and act.
Okay. I think you've made your point. Thank you very much. Yes.
I'm Sarah Sherman from the Net, the Adamsville Street, and I wanted to find, first of all, I'd like to echo Helen's remarks, saying thank you to Dr. Gold for the fabulous remarks today. And I'm trying to find a practical, strategic way to deal with this roadblock that we have by going to the Security Council. And I'm wondering if you think it might be helpful in a way of saying no to the culture of impunity and the culture of places where everybody is looking at the economy of the election. If we were to turn this into a companion sensitive Senate resolution and work on getting senators to sign this tactic as a way of getting to the administration to be able to define a Nuremberg kind of benefit
Well, I would defer to my American colleagues, but I certainly will bring it to their attention and hope that they will do that. It'll be their judgment to do it. I've got to get my Canadian colleagues on side. We also passed a resolution of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on International Human Rights, similar to what we've been talking about today. Of course, we're now in the midst of an election, so I'm glad I mentioned that, so they'll at least know that I made reference to what was happening in Canada while I was in Washington. But we will work with our counterparts in the Senate and see what we can do. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Irwin, you've got my vote. I'd like to thank the panel. You were wonderful. Some of you brought tears to our eyes. Irwin brought passion to us and said, why aren't we doing more? The whole panel today, the morning panel, chaired by Greg Stanton, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you very much. Dory, I think your session was very successful. People came early and they stayed late and they were involved. And thank you very much for setting us up. And I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you.